Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. As always, my name is Scott Daly, and I'm coming at you live from my chocolate throne inside my gingerbread house. It's very sticky.
And I'm Matt Freeman, leaning precariously far out on this balcony of the Dark Tower.
This week on the show, Ted tells his story, and the beam itself pulls an Oliver Twist on the quartet and asks for some more time. We're discussing chapters 8, 9, and 10 of Part 2, Blue Heaven. Matt, what did you think of this week's reading?
I loved it. It's heartbreaking. There's a lot of great little moments between characters that we're just going to talk about forever. And, you know, I guess the first thing I'll say is the way we wrapped up the last episode, I was like, all right, and now we're moving into the big gunfight. And I kept waiting for that gunfight to start for all chapters 8, 9, and 10, and it never did. Nope. Of course, I it's not like I mind, because ultimately I realized as we were going, like, okay, we actually needed to set the stakes in place a little bit more concretely and understand, like, okay, well, yeah, and just the character stuff in and of itself is fun for me. So yeah, I was very happy with this week's stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this week's reading is more what the Dark Tower is than the big old gunfights. So yeah, I mean they're in there, but
they're usually very, very short too. We've noticed this. So
yeah, I mean, we have 2 chapters left in this part, right? We have chapters 11 and 12, and so it seems like the fight itself is once again going to be a short part of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading these a whole bunch. This was a incredibly busy week for me. Not only is it Christmas and there's all the end of year crunch stuff we're doing at work, but I moved this past weekend and on Monday, so it was like an insanely busy time for me. But just getting the little moments that I had to carve out and read this book was just delightful. Like the character moments, you're absolutely right. Just this is some of the most enjoyable time I've had reading throughout this entire project.
Awesome.
Yeah. Which, before we go into our chapter discussion for this week, that is the big announcement, is that I've moved and I'm in a new studio, which means right now I'm in a very large room that is going to be my office / the playroom for my future child. And there's nothing on the wall, and it's a bigger room than I was in before, which means if my voice sounds a little bit different, if there's a little more echo, that's why. I'm going to be doing some stuff. We're going to be putting some stuff on the walls and reducing that as much as we can. But if my voice sounds different this week, I just want to say it's sorry. It's none of you are probably going to care. It's just going to be the type of thing that annoys me. But that's why I sound a little bit differently. I'm in a new location, and it's exciting, and I love this room. But I got some work to do on it.
We're going for more of a garage rock vibe with our podcast from now on.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. I mean, what is noise if you can't hear it and also hear it bouncing off my nearest wall, right?
Yeah, I mean, some people will buy an effects pedal for that kind of reverb. So
hopefully it's not that bad. We'll find out when I get into editing this thing, but hopefully it's just barely noticeable. All right, folks, let's just dive right into it. Matt, let's talk about our first chapter of the week, Chapter 8, Notes from the Gingerbread House. We begin our chapter as the quartet sits down to finally listen to the Ted Brodigan recordings that we were told about last week. We're told that our quartet listens to Ted talk for over 4 hours as he explains what brought him here and why and how, and he gives them all the information they might need to take this whole place down. Before we get into the details of Ted and his story, though, Matt, I just wanted to stop and reflect on this. We're reading roughly 75 pages this week, and I would say conservatively about 2/3 of them are taken up by Ted's story. Ted's story, of which only 1 or 2 small bits really, quote unquote, matter to the ongoing story of this book. But this is the Dark Tower, right? This is what the Dark Tower is. This is always what the Dark Tower has been. In the very first episode of the show, you hypothesized that this entire journey would just be flashbacks, storytelling, while Roland gets closer and closer to the Man in Black as he chases him across the desert. You were wrong, of course, but the one thing that you picked up on in that first episode was that storytelling itself matters to this story, and it's continued to matter, and it's gotten crazier and crazier as we've gone through. It's gotten more metatextual. It's gotten an examination of the concept of storytelling itself, but it's also still a book about people telling other people's stories. So while one could say that the story of Ted Brautigan's journey to the Devar-Toi isn't important to the plot, quote unquote, of Dark Tower, I'd say that it's everything. I'd say that this is the Dark Tower.
Yeah, I see what you mean there. Exactly. Once again, we have a big chunk of a book is in fact, a story, a tale told about somebody's past, in order that you can understand where they're coming from in the present of the story. Mm-hmm. And, we're going to talk in a bit about how this is so reminiscent of exactly what happened with Callahan.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, it's a treat at this point. Like, you're like, oh, yes, it's another interesting character whose backstory we can catch up on, Yeah. Like, it's always, and I think a good storyteller, a good author, a good writer does that, where like every time, I remember, it was always exciting when we would get to the interlude chapters of the Worm web serial that we did a podcast on, because it was like, oh, we're learning about the backstory of this character, right? And like, that's what a good storyteller does. They make you excited to take a digression.
Yeah. I think we're far enough along now where I can tell you that when we would have those conversations, I would always be thinking in the back of my head, oh yeah, this is just like what happens in the Dark Tower all the time. He doesn't call them interludes, but there are these character study interludes where we just dive deep into a character, whether they're an antagonist or one of our quartet or a new guy joining the fray. Like, King will halt the story and say, let's talk about this person for a little while.
It's cool.
That's what these books are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, cool.
Yeah. So the second thing I wanted to touch on here before we dive into it in a lot of detail is the way in which King kind of switches mode during the Ted Brautigan story, because he goes between dialogue as if we and the rest of the quartet are hearing the audio of Brautigan talking along with the quartet as the tapes are being played. But then he switches to this italicized text that he tends to use when we switch to quote unquote story mode. We saw this most recently with Jake's memories of the fear of the cartoon dinosaurs, that whole part with the mind trap. And then throughout the 50 pages that make up this story, King will switch back and forth between these two different styles, between almost like dialogue of Ted Brautigan talking and giving the story to this italicized storytelling mode. And he does this mostly so he can show us the reactions of the quartet. We kind of like go back into the active. We're in the cave listening to this stuff with them. But that's not all he's doing with it, because even in the italicized version, we're still seeing reactions from the Tet's perspective. And I want to highlight this one paragraph here to kind of highlight what I'm talking about here. Like, this is, I think, the first time the book switches to the italicized version of Ted's story. And it says here, when he begins again, it's to tell them he was born in Milford, Connecticut in the year 1898. We have all heard similar introductory lines, enough to know that they signal, for better or worse, the onset of autobiography. Yet as they listen to the voice, the gunslingers are visited by another familiarity. This is true even of Oy. At first they're not able to put their finger on it, but in time it comes to them. The story of Ted Brautigan, a wandering accountant instead of a wandering priest, is in many ways similar to that of Père Donald Callahan. They could almost be twins. And so I think this highlights really well the difference between the italicized text moments and the normal dialogue moments. It's storytelling, right? Like when King goes italics, he's doing his tale-telling voice. He's like switching to word slinging. He's switching to storytelling in the grand tradition of storytelling, and he jumps in and out of these two modes as the rhythm and the tone of the story he and Ted Brautigan are trying to tell demand it. And I just think it's so fascinating the way he does that.
Yeah, I agree. It is a distinctly different voice from his usual one. Mm-hmm. And it's done so deftly. You don't quite ever consciously notice that he's doing this. You don't notice it's happening when he jumps between Ted's speech and the narration. Mm-hmm. Also, obviously, we need to highlight the observation that, as the text points out about the comparison to Callahan, we have, these two older men, both of whom lived as wanderers between worlds, starting out on Earth, having their own unique brushes with the supernatural, spending years running from the consequences of their choice, finally ending up in Midworld to await their fates and to await the arrival of the Katet. So, I mean, the story, there's probably all sorts of other twinnings between the two of them that we could identify, and that might be fun to do. But those are just the first ones that popped into my mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's great because the story isn't, it doesn't want to just be subtextual with that, right? It wants you to know that immediately. It's like, yes, this is just like Per Callahan. And it gets you to wonder a lot about what Ted's role in the ongoing fight is going to be, and how he's going to serve, and how he's going to leave the Katet. Is it going to be similar to the pair? Is it not? We don't know.
That's a good point. I mean, it also really makes me wonder, when he was creating the character of Ted Brodigan for a completely different story, was he thinking, I'm going to pull this guy into the Dark Tower? Or was it just like, I have this idea for a psychic who could very well fit into the Dark Tower story, but I just for now have this one idea, I really would love to know what was his approach, like his mentality toward low men and yellow coats.
Yeah, I think we have a lot to say about that story and how it's going to reflect back on what's happening here. But I think that is a fascinating aspect of it. Like, obviously, when Per Callahan was created, there was no chance of any of this being in King's mind. But
right.
But Ted is a little bit closer. A little bit. It's 4 years between the creation of Ted and this moment. So was there something in his head? Was it maybe not he's going to appear in the Dark Tower series, but was it, I'm going to make a character that's connected to it in some way?
Right.
When was the decision made to include the low men in this way? We don't know.
I'd be curious. I mean, I'm sure at some point we'll read that story. I'm just curious to know if, like, is it evident in that book that the low men are in fact these like creatures? Because I'm not asking for an answer. I just
sure. I wasn't going to tell you one. So
I'm just curious to know, like, how long ago he figured he came up with that idea.
So I think that's a great like introduction to this part of the book. But it's time for us to move into the details of it, Matt. And I love, as we start the story, we get Roland's initial reaction to it. King kind of jumps forward in time and has Roland, after the 4 hours, his reaction to it and the knowledge that the story brings to him. And it says the knowledge frightened him because their chances of success were slim. The feeling of Kashum made that clear. And one did not really understand stakes until one glimpsed the goddess in her white robe, the bitch goddess whose sleeves fell back to reveal her comely white arm as she beckoned, "Come to me, run to me. Yes, it's possible. You may gain your goal. You may win. So run to me. Give me your whole heart. And if I break it, if one of you falls short, falls into the pit of Kaffa, the place your new friends call hell, too bad for you. Yes, if one of them fell into Kaffa and burned within sight of the fountains, that would be too bad indeed. And the bitch in the white robe, why, she'd only put her hands on her hips and throw back her head and laugh as the world ended."
That's so great. That's such a great framing of the mood, right? And I love this cascade of imagery. Like, it's a very cool thing he's doing, because one thing that doesn't happen while you're reading this is you don't go, "What? White robe? Fountains? What?" You just kind of go, "Okay, cool. This must be imagery from Roland's culture that makes sense to him." And you just kind of go with it. And like, it's sort of close enough to stuff we might recognize that we just let it wash over us and then we move on. And then it kind of, it does kind of resonate though. It's like, I don't think we have a bitch goddess in a white robe in our mythology, but like, I still get it. I still understand the symbol.
You don't need to be told exactly what the symbol means to get the contextual meaning of it here. Like this excitement, this beckoning of, you're so close, you're going to make it. And yet, you know that it's going to cost you something. And that's that. To get into like a wider look at this whole thing, that's the thing that's most fascinating to me here, because Roland and I think King, in some ways, I think never really work on instilling doubt of success in this operation, right? Like, I think there's an inherent like trope understanding here that our characters are not going to fail in their attempt to overthrow Algol Siento, right? Like, they're not going to die, and everyone's not going to die here because there's still 500 pages left in the book. And so if everyone dies, game over, what happens? And like, we know this. And because the book is meta in and of itself, it knows this too. And so the book is acknowledging that the stakes of this whole thing are not, will we win? It's, what is it going to cost us? And that seems to be a recurring theme. Like, there, by the end of this week's reading, there are going to be two operations our quartet needs to take. And they don't seem to doubt that either will be successful, but that it's going to cost something. And we just don't know what that is. And that's where the tension is. That's where the suspense is. What is the cost going to be?
Yes. Yeah. Our Kef is too strong, as I was literally going to say. It's not about, are they going to win? It's about, what's the price going to be? What's the sacrifice going to be specifically in this story? What are our characters going to sacrifice to win out? And because they're going to win out. And we hope they don't sacrifice too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what does it mean? What does it mean when they sacrifice those things? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Ted's story begins with him kind of demonstrating that he knows that Roland and his quartet are coming. And then he wonders if they'll even actually get here. It says, "Where are you now, Roland? In Maine, looking for the writer? The one who also created me after a fashion? In New York, looking for Eddie's wife? Are any of you even still alive? I know the chances of you reaching Thunderclap aren't good. Ka is drawing you to the Devar-Toi, but a very powerful anti-Ka, set in motion by the one you call the Crimson King, is working against you and your Tet in 1,000 ways." Wait. Anti-Ka? Matt.
What?
Matt.
What's this? What's this shit? See, that's in a way, I love that he does this, because like, we were so smug over here saying, "Oh, we figured it out. We understand what Ka is now. We cracked the code. We are better than all of the scholars of Gilead." And then King is like, "Oh yeah," and then like anti-Ka is also a thing. So, and that doesn't fit with my model of anything, because let me try though. Like, okay, if you take our working definition of Ka and just try to guess what anti-Ka would mean based on that, I would have to guess it's the force that ruins or stops a story, viewed from within that story, of course. So like, one such way would be to kill the storyteller, which is, of course, what the Crimson King is sort of trying to do, or maybe literally trying to do. Other than that, like, other than trying to stop the story or break the story or kill the storyteller or ruin the story so that the story stops being told, I can't really think of what anti-Ka would mean in context of our current model of Ka.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's introduced to us in this way, and we don't get any opportunity for any of our characters to comment on it. Like, we don't get a moment where Roland like looks at the rest of his quartet and says, "That's not a thing," right? or confirms that it is a thing, right? It's just this one-off message, and I wonder, in a not close reading like we're doing, if people just move on from that and say, "Oh yeah, it's just like the Crimson King is trying to force something to happen that he wants to happen." But I mean, you're right that our understanding of Ka up until this point has been that there's nothing above it, that like it's folly to assume that you could go against it. But on the other hand, by the end of this chapter, our characters are basically going to say, "We're going to try to change Ka." And Roland says point blank, it's possible to change Ka. It costs something, of course, but it is possible to do so. So isn't that just kind of an anti-Ka in and of itself? Or a maybe not an anti-Ka, but like a adjacent? I don't know.
I don't know. I guess I'm happy that Ka is not something that I can say that I just understand, that it continues to be this thing that morphs and reveals new dimensions. But yeah, I don't know. I'm excited to see it. It's interesting in and of itself that Ted even knows what Ka is. I mean, I guess he's lived in Midworld for a long time, and people there probably just talk about it all the time. But I mean, who knows what else? He might just have like looked into their minds or whatever. But
yeah, I think that probably comes from just some mind Robin.
Yeah. But I'm fascinated by Anti-Ka. Hopefully we find out more. I hope when we find out more like what the Crimson King's deal is, we'll find out more about like what that means exactly. But we'll see.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because it almost seems that Ted's later story almost contradicts that like the Crimson King has been trying to kill Stephen King his entire life, right? Like that's his stated goal, has been trying to eliminate Stephen King, but it is not him that finally gets to do it. It is only Ka that allows that to happen because he's gone off his chosen path, right? So it's like that almost seems to contradict what's being said here, is that like the Crimson King failed again and again and again and again because you can't stop, you can't anti-Ka.
Yeah.
But then the only way King could ever actually die is because if Ka wills it to be so. So I don't know. I just don't know.
We also know for a fact that King doesn't die. So
true.
I mean, if we're using that as part of the story, which I don't see how we can avoid doing, then the Crimson King does fail to kill Stephen King in at least one world. So
yeah, that's true. He failed in the old real world,
the old one where we are.
Take that, Crimson King.
Yep.
So we learn that the Hume guards of the Devar-Toi call the Breakers Morks after the Mork and Mindy Robin Williams sitcom from the late 70s when TV was very different. Where the concept of a sitcom is he's an alien and he lives with you. Comedy.
And he's Robin Williams.
Williams.
That's the premise is Robin Williams is on TV. Tune in. It's Robin Williams, everyone.
Yes. But they call the Breakers Morks after Robin Williams' character Mork from that show. And we learn a little bit about the Morks here. And I think a lot of these last few chapters, before we have this big fight, it seems King really wants us to understand who these people are. And the way Ted describes the Morks here is that they're selfish people. They're self-absorbed. They generally don't care about anyone else. They're not concerned. I think the description is like what the thing he says is when Dinky hears Sheemie crying in his room and goes and checks on him, and that no one else, no other breaker would have done that. That this is a unique trait of these two. And even if another breaker did work up the courage to knock on someone's door and ask if they're okay, the breaker crying would have just told him to get the fuck out of there. And it's just, it really sells the uniqueness of these characters while at the same time defining the breakers in a very, very distinct way.
Yeah. I mean, a very negative way too.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about this because I wasn't sure. Like, is the book saying that the idea is that psychic humans are bad people? Like psychic people tend to be assholes? Or did they filter for the assholes and they only brought the assholes to the Devar-Toi? Or, like third option, is the environment of the Devar-Toi just the kind of place that turns people into selfish assholes? And I can't really figure out which answer we're supposed to assume.
I think what it's saying is that the tendency to have these powers turns you into a kind of selfish asshole. That like this ability, these abilities, like not that all people with this power. I think it goes back to the 10 buddy comparison, right? That like not everyone with these powers are psychopaths, but every psychopath is a person with these kind of powers is what they're kind of saying here. Okay, that there is some sort of effect that this has on people that makes them like this. And obviously it's not across the board because we have 3 examples of people who are not like this, but they are defined as the rarity in this whole situation.
Something about Sheemie kind of occurred to me this week, which I guess might have occurred to me last week too, but just the idea that as we see, his power causes him to have like brain hemorrhages basically. And I was like, oh, so does that mean that that the reason why he's mentally handicapped is that his power caused him to be this way? Like that, I never considered that the causality might work in that direction, but the book doesn't tell us, but it's interesting to consider.
I think there's an argument to be made there for sure. Yeah, so we're told that all these people are selfish assholes and they're awful, and then we're told the exception, of course, are Sheemie and our new friend Dinky Earnshaw. And I love this part here, right here. For a long time, I was alone here. I was a Mork who cared, whether I liked it or not. Then there was Sheemie, brave enough to accept comfort if comfort was offer, and Dink, who was willing to reach out. Most Morks are selfish introverts masquerading as rugged individualists. They want the world to see them as Daniel Boone types, and the Alghoul staff loves it, believe me. No community is easier to govern than one that rejects the very concept of community. Do you see why I was attracted to Sheemie and Dinky, and how lucky I was to find them? Susanna's hand crept into Eddie's. He took it and squeezed it gently. So I love all of this. I love every part of this. Like, once again, we have King taking all this time to explain to us who and what the Breakers are. He'll later call the three of these people three rebels in a society dedicated to the idea of going along to getting along, even if it means the end of existence, which is such a powerful idea, right? Like it's almost a contradiction in and of itself. Like this idea that like a group of people would keep going along with it just to get through the day, even if they knew that what they were doing would cause the end of everything. Mm-hmm. And yet they do. Like King is positing that, yeah, that would happen though. Mm-hmm. That would still happen.
Yeah, this is really emerging as a persistent theme in this book specifically and across the series. This idea of people, like you said, going along to get along, just mm-hmm. Keeping their head down and doing the job that's in front of them. It's very much the greatest evil is for good men to do nothing concept.
Yeah.
Not that they're not even necessarily good. They're just normal, I guess. Like
yeah.
The banality of evil. Which is we talked about. We kind of enumerated as being one of the standard King themes.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I mean, this is so much like the Caliban Sturgis people, right? I mean, it's different. The stakes are higher here, but this is the same kind of concept, right? Where they were just going along with this system because it's easier than trying to change it.
Yeah, right. Because in their case, at least, it was like, well, the risk of trying to change it is worse than just going along, right? And I guess there's a chance that there's something to be said here that like, well, if they don't cooperate, then they get negative consequences, but it seems like they don't even need to use the negative consequences. They're just like, yeah, whatever, I'll go along. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It takes such a light leash to get them to comply. Which
yeah,
I think,
we also see them as the kind of the outsiders of society, right? Mm-hmm. Where and I think Ted's story here is so important in understanding this and why a person would be so desperate to use their power to do something in a world that people just don't want it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the main themes of Ted's story.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think I love the concept of it. I love the idea that we're once again painting these people in a very specific light. We did not have to do this. The Breakers did not have to be these complex characters. They could have just been slaves or prisoners or forced to do this thing, but that's not the way King decided to do it. And I continue to love the complexity of it. It just takes what could have been just a normal prison break genre dive into something so much more complicated than that.
Absolutely. It's the kind of thing that makes me say like, okay, like I get why you thought this was a series that deserved to be talked about for 80 million hours because it's a story where the theme has informed everything, and mm-hmm. the themes of the story are appearing here in a way where it's like, oh yeah, it could have just been a pat prison break, but King wouldn't do that because he's making sure every detail, every plot movement, every setting conforms with the idea of like, what are we trying to say? What is this story about?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's happening here yet again. In fact, I almost like it's just absolutely asinine that I ever thought that this would just be a normal prison break, because it's like, no, what does that have to do with the Dark Tower series? That's not a thing that would happen in this series based on anything about my understanding of the themes. So
yeah, and it's not even enough for him that he wants there to be complex theming in how and why these people are behaving the way they are. He wants you to understand them, and he wants you to understand them in a way that is not judgy. Like, I think he could write the story in a way where you're like, fuck all these people, fuck them, I hate them. And that's just not what he does really with any of his villains. Like, even the ones that you really hate, even the antagonists that you really, really hate, there's always these moments, and we've talked about this so much. We talked about it last week with Pimley. There's always these moments where we're like, okay, like I get you. I don't think you're good, and I don't think what you're doing is good, and I don't think your reasoning justifies your actions here. But like, I get it. He seems like he has this strong drive to understand people in every possible way, including the worst possible ways. And understanding doesn't mean like
absolving.
Yeah, thanks, that's the word I was looking for. But it is so important to him, and so that's the things he continues to circle around.
Yeah. I mean, we all have times, at least, when we want to be Daniel Boone types.
Yeah.
So we can all kind of relate to the idea of like, oh, I can see myself in this.
Yeah, definitely. So there's this little moment here where we learned that Ted is speaking to the group inside a literal gingerbread house, like it's candy furniture and all, and we learn that he's in a pocket dimension, a hypodermic hole in the living flesh of reality, a balcony on the flank of the Dark Tower, a real place, as hard as it might be to believe. So we learned that Sheemie has teleported him to this place, has made this pocket dimension where time doesn't move, and he can spend as much time as he wants there. And they've teleported him to this, and that's where they hide. That's where they sneak weaponry and all the supplies that they have. This literal gingerbread house.
Such a fun idea. And we got pocket dimensions that Sheemie can create, and he makes them into fun wonderlands because he's Sheemie. It's just delightful.
Yeah. I love that when he's trying to explain, and Ted, one of the fun things about this whole thing is because we're listening to it in tape, we kind of see Ted struggle with how to explain certain things, and he's trying to explain how this whole thing works. And the idea that he says like, look, reality is like alive, right? There's like a living flesh to the walls of reality, and what Sheemie does is he just pokes a little pocket in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a fun image. I really like it.
Yeah. That's a visceral, very Stephen King way of describing the making of a pocket dimension, for sure.
Yes. So we finally begin the story of Theodore Broughton, an especially gifted man who tried as hard as he could to use his special power for the good of the world. We see that he tries to enlist in the army during World War II, and when he's declared 4F, he tries to explain his talent by doing some number guessing games, but the doctors won't listen to him. Worse, one of them lies and changes his number to make Ted's power wrong. And this is fascinating because I think this is kind of our defining moment for young Theodore here. At the end of a 6-mile walk around Hartford, he thinks he understands something else as well. They will never believe. None of them. Not ever. They'll refuse to see that a fellow who could read the collective mind of the German High Command could be mildly useful. A fellow who could tell the Allied High Command where the next big German push was going to come. A fellow who could do a thing like that a few times, maybe even just once or twice, might be able to end the war by Christmas. But he won't have the chance because they won't give it to him. And why? It has something to do with the second doctor changing his number when Ted landed on it, and then refusing to write another one down. Because somewhere deep down, they want to fight, and a guy like him would spoil everything. It's something like that.
That's interesting. That's interesting, partly because I didn't necessarily see it that way at first.
Sure.
Like the first place my head went is that, I'll say I'm a doctor. I have a patient. I see myself as rational. I see the world as being predictable and making sense. And this patient does something that just doesn't make any sense, sort of would shatter my worldview if I accepted it. It's like evidence of magical powers, basically. And I think the normal human response is to just try to forget that ever happened, or at least a normal human response. The ability to just kind of compartmentalize away something that doesn't fit within your worldview is very, very normal.
Sure.
So I honestly didn't think like, oh, it's because the doctor wants to make sure World War II gets to happen. I thought it was more. I mean, that might be somewhere in there, and since the character is telling us this in a story, in a sense, I think we're supposed to accept it, but also that's not what I thought was happening in the scene. I guess I wanted to get your reaction to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think my response is not that because a character is telling us in a story, I have to accept it. My response is I think this is supposed to help us see who Ted is. Because you're absolutely right that my gut reaction to this, to a person refusing to see that a power like Ted's exists, is just because it completely alters their worldview in a way that they're not able to deal with. It would not go directly to no. Human beings are inherently destructive and they want the fight and the challenge but I do think it makes sense as a thing that defines why Ted would have signed up to do this kind of stuff in the first place. Like the idea of Ted's story is being used to define him as a character, but it's also being used to define the Breakers as a whole as characters. And like going directly to this idea that like deep down somewhere humanity is inherently violent, they want to fight, and they're going to subconsciously refuse any magic power that would make life easier, is such a good way of defining why people with these powers feel so individualist, why they are so outside it all, why they are so removed from society in a way that they could be easily preyed on by these people that want to take them and use them to end the world, right? I think it's a perfect way, like, because Ted goes to that, and you could make assumptions that a lot of the other Breakers would have gone to the same conclusion right away. It's like, no one is ever going to want to use my power because they don't want to live in a world where people like me can make things easier for them. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, that's what starts people on this road to individualism, and Ted, because he's different, doesn't go quite as far down the same road as some of the other Breakers, but enough to get him to the Devar-Toi.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So it's not that we're supposed to agree with Ted, it's that we're supposed to see that Ted and people like him are going to think this way, and it makes them feel alienated. And I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, because I fundamentally agree with you that, like, just because the character's saying it doesn't mean, oh, that's therefore word of God, we're supposed to accept it. But I was like, oh, that just deviated so far from my first thought that I had to take it seriously, right? Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, cool.
Sure. We also see in this kind of introductory story how Ted uses his power to murder someone out of anger. He gets mugged by someone, and out of anger he lashes out at them using his power, and he kills them. And this is when we cut out of the italics back to the regular speech, and we see how King uses the quartet to reflect on this act. And it says, he'd killed the man by accident, they all would have agreed. They had come to live by the gun and knew the difference between by accident and on purpose without needing to discuss the matter. And it strikes me how little the clarifier by accident would have mattered to a person like Ted. Like, I don't think he would have felt better about that. It's like, oh, okay, I didn't mean to do it, then I feel fine about murdering someone. But to a gunslinger, to a person who deals in death by accident and on purpose, are all that matter when kind of trying to moralize death in these kind of ways.
Yeah, I mean, we love our gunslinger quartet, but they kill people accidentally before breakfast most days, and it really humanizes Ted and makes him relatable to show how hard he takes it. Because your average person, if they accidentally kill somebody, doesn't really matter how, they're gonna freak out. It's like, it's
You're
funny.
Not just gonna roll up to him and be like, "Don't worry, it wasn't on purpose," and they're like, "Oh, okay, I feel better now."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like it's funny because we read stories all the time about murderers, and we come to accept them so readily, but like in real life, like accidentally killing someone is a serious thing that happens rarely, and really hurts the people who do it, right?
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's just we're bringing a normal person into the story. This is not a gunslinger. I don't think Ted Brodigan is going to become a gunslinger. I don't think he's going to be like Per Callahan, where he becomes a gunslinger. That he doesn't seem like the kind of person. He doesn't have the mettle for it, Or I mean, maybe I'm being unfair to him, but it's currently my assessment of him in terms of what we've seen him do. He doesn't seem like a gunslinger.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, like, we've been looking at it from the one side of like, is like they would be saying it to make him feel better, but also to a gunslinger, like killing is so rote that like, yeah, it's just like an on purpose killing is the only kind that matters to them, right? Like they're people that deal in death like that. And when they kill, they're doing it on purpose, and that's the type of killing they do. This accidental stuff, it's not the same. That's not gunslinging.
Yeah
It's so fascinating. So Ted sees a job posting for the opportunity of a lifetime, and being a man desperate to prove himself, Ted goes in for an interview. And I love the interview questions. We have to kind of stop and talk about this, because the question that King shows us here is this one. You come to a stop near an overturned car on a little traveled road. Trapped in the car is a young man crying for rescue. You ask, "Are you hurt, young man?" To which he responds, "I don't think so." In the field nearby is a satchel filled with money. You, A, rescue the young man and give him back his money. B, rescue the young man, but insist the money be taken to the local police. C, take the money and go on your way, knowing that although the road may be little traveled, someone will be along eventually to free the young man. D, none of the above.
And obviously you can't read capitalization, but I love the kind of not random, but kind of odd capitalization of the words in the question.
Yeah.
It just it makes you think of just an insane person's manifesto. I don't know.
Because like satchel and money are capitalized.
Yeah. The young man. Yeah.
Yeah. It's great.
It's minor, but it's the kind of thing where it's like it feels weird. It just feels a little bit weird, and I like it.
Yeah. So Ted answers C, not because it's what he would actually do, but it's because it's what he would think they would want him to do. And it's so funny because like this is taking a concept that is true in real life, right? Like these are what these tests are, right? You never answer a test like this truly honestly. You answer a test like this what you think the people asking you the question want you to answer. And in most cases, what the people asking you the question want you to answer is probably B, right? That's probably what they would want you to answer. But in this, they want him to answer C. And Ted has a little extra mind power to know this for certain, the way he answers it. And of course, it's literally no surprise that the worst answer is the one that the servants of the Crimson King would want. But it's also this clever thing where they're like, no one would assume that the question askers would want C, so the people that choose C must only know that through telepathy. And it's revealed that this is all just a do you have telepathy test.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And also not only have telepathy, but be willing to answer a test in a way that makes you look like a bad person, which maybe is also why there's like a concentration of unusually bad people in the Devar-Toi, possibly.
Yeah, sure. It takes a certain person to not only be able to read your mind and know that you want the worst answer, but to pick that one anyway because you're so indifferent to how you're viewed, because you are a rugged individualist that doesn't care about how people perceive you.
Yeah, exactly.
It's perfect. So he finds out that they are looking for telepaths who are going to help on some secret, super important mission. And because Ted has, as we see from very early in his life, been looking for something to do with his power, he signs on. And we go to this whole explanation of how much they're going to be paid for this work that they're going to be doing. And I love this part here, which sounds incredible. Ted said from the wall in sec. Of course it did, by Jiminy. I didn't find it until later how incredibly cheap they were buying us, even at those prices. Dinky is particularly eloquent on the subject of their stinginess. They, in the case being all King's bureaucrats. He said that the Crimson King is trying to bring about the end of all creation on a budget plan. And of course he's right. But I think even Dinky realizes, although he won't admit it, of course, that if you offer a man too much, he simply refuses to believe it. Or, depending on his imagination, many telepaths and precogs have almost no imagination at all, be unable to believe it. I love little beats like this, which allow us to learn something about the Crimson King and his men, about Ted, and about Dinky all at the same time. These little beats and asides that don't move the story forward, but are just rich with characterization on multiple levels from multiple angles. And King seems to just do this effortlessly. They just happen again and again and again. And I just love them.
I mean, as you were reading that, more things were popping out to me, because I was like, telepaths and precogs have almost no imagination. Who do we know who has almost no imagination? Who's repeatedly remarked as having no imagination. I mean, that's interesting.
Sure.
Roland from time to time does have kind of psychic moments, but they're nothing like Jake's. But it does make you wonder, like, well, maybe there's more kind of power to him than we necessarily understand. Yeah, I mean, it's always, like you said, it's always really fun and kind of unexpected when we take these moments to lift the curtain a bit and show that maybe the fearsome power of the Crimson King might both rely on and be somewhat fettered by all of the like stupid, selfish people that he has to rely on.
Yeah.
Because I mean, one imagines that like every person in the evil chain of command is embezzling because that's the kind of people they are. So like it must be really difficult to get your evil work done when you have to employ people like that.
Yeah, I mean, I doubt the Crimson King auditing department is doing a very good job at checking if the financial controls are being followed correctly.
Yeah. I mean, like that's the thing is, like on the flip side, you probably just summarily execute people when you find that they've embezzled. But I don't think that's really a good incentive, to this kind of person, like, because they're like, well, I'm going to get away with it, right? So it's very fun to imagine. It's always fun to see like what the bad side looks like and realize like, well, maybe it's not as you imagine it to be necessarily.
Yeah. But I think it's also just true that if they said $100 million to do this work, people would just be like, okay, come on. Like you're full of shit. Like, too good to be true, regardless of whether or not they're trying to honeypot people and they need to make the honeypot close to believable.
I mean, it also very much reminds me of what just happened, where Ted says, hey, I have psychic powers, doctor. And and like for the doctor, it's like, well, that's too good to be true. You're obviously a charlatan. You're lying. You're manipulating. I'm going to just disbelieve you because that doesn't, that's too good to be true. Like if you really wanted to convince somebody you had psychic powers, and you really did have psychic powers, then you might have to downplay them at first, right? You might have to just to kind of pique their curiosity and pull them in with some very minor demonstrations that didn't quite show what you could really do, because if you showed what you could really do, they would just freak out or not believe it.
No, this is a great pull, because he did, like, it even falls back to numbers again, right? When the second doctor came in, he says, okay, pick another number between 1 and 1 million, right? He shoots up in numbers to the most impressively high number to make a point. And yeah, it has that same exact effect. I think you're totally right. That's a great connection. I love that.
It's really interesting. Cool.
Yeah. So regardless of all this, though, Ted gets the job and takes the job. And then he and some friends are carted through a door and into the thunderclap. And then we find them here at Algo Ciento. And again, Ted and King take some time here to try and make us understand what it means to be a breaker, why these people do this. He likes the roof over his head. He likes the company. The guards are guards, yeah, but he believes them when they say it's as much their job to keep bad stuff from getting in as it is to make sure the breakers don't get out. He likes most of the inmates, too, and realizes after a year or two that the inmates need him in some strange way. He's able to comfort them when they get the mean reds. He's able to assuage their crampy waves of homesickness with an hour or so of murmured conversation. And surely this is a good thing. Maybe it's all a good thing. Certainly it feels like a good thing. To be homesick is human, but to break is divine. He tries to explain to Roland and his Tet, but the best he can do, the closest he can come, is to say like, it's fine. It's like finally being able to scratch that out of reach place on your back that always drives you crazy with its mild but persistent itch. He likes to go to the study, and so do all the others. He likes to feel the feeling of sitting there, of smelling the good wood and good leather, of searching, and then suddenly, there you are. You're hooked in, swinging like a monkey on a limb. You're breaking, baby, and to break is divine. And then a little bit later, maybe once, just after the Prim withdrew and Gan's voice still echoed in the rooms of the Macroverse, the beams were smooth and polished, but those days are gone. Now the way of the bear and the turtle is lumpy and eroded, full of coves and cols and bays and cracks, plenty of places to get your fingers in and take hold. And sometimes you drag at it, and sometimes you can feel yourself worming your way into it like a drop of acid that can think. All of these sensations are intensely pleasurable, sexy. So there's a lot here, Matt, and there's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah.
Obviously, on the basic level, just this understanding that this feels good, man. It's not like that. This act of destroying the universe is a drug for them. This is another way our addiction metaphor is playing out. That this feels good.
Yeah. I mean, all this stuff about the breakers it puts a negative cast on the idea of being a psychic. Because if destroying the fabric of reality feels good, feels sexy, and also on top of that, we learned that like it seems like almost all these people are borderline sociopaths. It's like, okay, I'm suddenly really uncomfortable about the idea of psychics in King's world. I mean, which is very interesting because like Jake is this really powerful psychic who, I think we're meant to believe could have been a breaker in terms of the level of his powers. So it's like, well, Jake doesn't seem that bad.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a reason why Jake isn't here, right? He's on the other side of this whole thing.
That's true. Yeah, that's the thing is you can either take it that way or you can take it as like, well, maybe Jake has the capacity for this kind of darkness too.
Sure, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is like this is magic, kind of, right? Like you could make an argument that this kind of power that these people have is a remnant of the magic that was around when the Prim first receded. And we've had this strong, clear metaphor of magic good, technology bad. But yeah, it is interesting that we're taking time to paint these powers in this way. And it's almost, I don't want to say the power itself is inherently bad. The magic itself is inherently bad. It's just the people that have it that seem to be less than perfect.
Yeah. It's just so interesting that using it to destroy the beam feels good, right? I mean, maybe it's just that using it in general feels good and they rarely get the opportunity to use it. And so that's the real root of it. I don't know. I'm interested to see if we learn anything more about, the nature of being a psychic in this world. I'd be fine if we didn't, but especially because we have Jake as this important central character. And it feels like this feels like a big reveal, honestly. Like it feels like in some other fantasy series, you've got your wizard characters, you've got your natural mage or whatever, and you go through the series believing certain things about what that means, and then you like meet the other mages in the mage college and they're all horrible. Then you'd be like, oh, well, what does this say about our character, right? What does this say about the nature of this magic that we kind of thought we understood, but it seems like we maybe don't.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's also something like, I don't know, like, when you get a new electronic thing and you have to like peel the protective cover off of it, and there's sexy. Like there's a satisfying feeling of that. I don't know if I'd ever call it sexy, but there is, I mean, some truth to this idea that like this is just a mental version of peeling that protective layer off of something whose goal is to protect the thing, and you're peeling it away. You're exposing it to potential damage, and yet it feels good. We just bought a new fridge for my house, and it was like covered in this stuff, and I got to take it off for like 30 minutes. I was like, yeah, this is awesome. I love this.
Yeah, it's you're breaking something that was perfect before. It's no longer perfect, and you've essentially ruined something, but it feels good.
I can't wait till my fridge appears in my dream as a beaten up boy asking me why I did this to it. Yeah,
just the fridge there with just like fingerprints all over the surfaces where you took the plastic off.
It's not too late.
Yeah,
it's not too late.
I just wanted to be shiny and chrome.
Wonderful. So Ted goes on to tell us about how he figured out what was really going on in the Devar-Toi. It's from a low man named Trampus. We learn that Trampus isn't really like the other low men, Matt. He isn't jealous of the other humans. And I love this detail that we get here that the Cantoi desperately want to be human, right? It's why they wear these human masks. And it's why they kind of dress in this garish, like human way. And it's kind of why they resent the Breakers, because they can never be as human as these humans are. And it's such a fun little quirk of these characters that we've only really gotten very limited understanding of.
Yeah, once again, kind of as we peer into something we kind of thought maybe we understood, we realize we had a simplistic understanding, because the Cantoi end up being this really interesting science fiction concept here. Like they're monsters from the abyss, but they want to be human. I mean, at this point, it seems like every monster of the abyss that we meet eventually reveals itself to have this spark of, like, I don't know, humanity or goodness, or the white inside of them. I mean, we saw this with Mia. Mordred has become surprisingly sympathetic as a being. Not that he was from the abyss, but like, yeah, I mean, it's not that the spark always wins out, or even necessarily wins out very often, but it seems like every once in a while there's enough of a spark in these, creatures who are otherwise demonic, that it causes them to do one single important good thing, like Mia choosing to save Susanna, or in this case, we have Trampus, basically doing a good thing, doing sort of an uncomplicatedly good and honorable thing by not, turning on Ted. Yeah.
It's very interesting, because we do find that Trampus is kind of uniquely human as compared to a lot of these other ones, right? Like he is not jealous of him, and he laughs. They describe his laugh as real. That all the other low men have this laugh that is obviously fake. It's like Data trying to laugh when he doesn't have the emotion chip in, but Trampus laughs like Data when he does have the emotion chip in, because it's a real laugh, right? And so he is unique amongst these Cantoi, and I love the line where it's like, who would have known that a little bit of eczema could have saved the entire universe? But that's exactly what happens here, right? Because Trampus, this uniquely human low man, has eczema, and it makes him take off his thinking cap to scratch, and that's when Ted gets to read his mind very briefly and learn. He learns all about the tower. He learns about what they're doing. He learns about himself. He learns that he is what he calls the facilitator. I'm like a microphone for a singer, or a steroid for a muscle. I hype them. Say there's a unit of force, call it darks, all right? In the study, 20 or 30 people may be able to put out 50 darks an hour without me. With me, maybe it jumps to 500 darks an hour, and it jumps all at once. We'll learn a little bit later that Ted actually accelerated this project by possibly hundreds of years. Like, the reason why this beam is about to fall now is because Ted was there facilitating all these breakers for so long. And that his work here and now is part of his guilt over that act, that fact. I find it really interesting that, like, there is no moment in the storytelling where anyone seems to hold that against Ted, right? Roland nor his Katet never talk about how they hate him or blame him or anything. Perhaps it's because he's now working to undo it, and so they don't hold that against him.
Yeah, perhaps. Also, this whole story has been this parade of characters who made mistakes trying to live them down, including, I would say, most of our Katet. So, maybe it's enough for them that he didn't really realize what he was doing. And so it's not like he's evil and he was trying to destroy the universe. He's just a flawed human who makes mistakes like they are. And I think you're right. When he realized what was going on, then it seems like he more or less immediately started trying to, first escape and now rectify it. Yeah,
I mean, this is, to go back to Caliber and Sturgis again, this is like Tian Jaffords, right? Who was just as complicit in everything that was going on in the Cala throughout, but he's the one that stood up and said, no more, we have to do something. And so Roland is fiercely angry at everyone else that continues to, but has a lot of respect for this man who who looks at the problem and says, no, we have to do something. And that's similar to what Ted's doing here.
Yeah, I agree.
So when Ted finds out what's going on, Sheemie helps him out by teleporting out of the thunderclap, and he teleports him right into Connecticut and into a Stephen King novella by the name of Low Man and Yellow Coats. Ted doesn't tell us the story, so we can't really talk about it, but I guess we'll have to read it on season 2 of Kingslingers, right?
I guess so. I do think it's fun how like the both this one and the Callahan story were basically like, so the plot of that book happened.
Yeah.
And anyway, then we're going to pick up after that. And it's like, okay, I just have to read those books. God damn it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it literally says, but that's a tale for another time, which is just literally true because it's a tale
for you
another time.
For you, the reader, to read another time. Yeah.
It's great. Regardless, he's at the end of that story, he's caught and brought back to Devar-Toi, and when Pimley and his goons are questioning him, he's refusing to sell out Sheemie, but also he refused to sell out Trampas as well. And so Trampas gives him some info, and this is when we really get into some really important details for this plot thing that we have to talk about every once in a while. He said all of the other side worlds, there's one that's unique. They call it the real world. All Trampas seems to know about it is that it's real in the same way Midworld was, before the beams began to weaken and Midworld moved on. In America side of the special real world, he says, time sometimes jerks, but always runs one way, ahead. And in the world lives a man who served as a kind of facilitator. He may even be a mortal guardian of Gan's beam. Now, however, Ka, not the Red King, but plain old Ka, has decreed that this man, this guardian, or whatever he is, should die. He stopped, you see. Whatever song it was he was supposed to sing, he stopped. And that has finally made him vulnerable. But not to the Crimson King. Trampas kept telling me that. No, it's Ka he's vulnerable to. He no longer sings, Trampas said. His song, the one that matters, has ended. He has forgotten the rose. So let's talk about this for a bit, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big idea there. I mean, so first of all, it's like King is saying the universe tried to kill me because I stopped writing the Dark Tower, which is very something. I don't know. bold of him to say. But all like, so anyway, like if we're assuming that this is, within the story, let's just go within the story rather than outside of the story. If you assume this is true, so I guess it's like if you stop serving the function as the storyteller, then the force of storytelling, which is Ka, figures the only way to get some drama out of your existence is to kill you dramatically. Is that's my model of this now. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, you got to mind drama in any way you can. So
yeah,
if the storyteller is not going to write anymore, let's kill him. And then maybe someone else will pick up the mantle.
He made the mistake of putting himself in the story. So now we got to kill him.
We know this isn't true because George R. R. Martin's still alive.
Well, yeah, I mean, good point. Maybe Ka
he hasn't
really
been hit by a van yet.
He hasn't been hit by a van, but maybe Ka really wants those other books that he writes to get written. The dragon histories or whatever.
Fire and Blood. I think I still haven't read that book.
Me neither.
Yeah, I mean that's something we need to get into in a bit. Is the fact that the book King is writing, instead of writing the Dark Tower, according to this book, is Hearts in Atlantis.
Yeah,
which is the book in which the character of Ted Brodigan is created. There's a lot going on here.
It's Ka.
Mm-hmm. So Ted, at the end of his tape, begins to tell our group about the Ka of 19, which is the Ka of their world, Midworld, and the Ka of 99, which is the Ka of the real world, combining into something. The tape suddenly ends, and we miss arguably the most important part of this whole thing. But our quartet kind of figures it out on their own. Susanna finally tells them of her dream in which King dies, and they reason together that it's going to happen on June 19th, 1999, which good guessing. Ding, ding, ding. Correct. They got it.
Yeah, well, it's more dramatic that way, so of course they did.
Yeah, sure. And then we have this part where Roland kind of points out the aches and the pains he's been having. He says, "Here's where it hurts," he said, as if speaking to himself. He touched his right hip, then his ribs, last the side of his head. "I've been having headaches, worse and worse. Saw no reason to tell you." He drew his diminished right hand down to his right side. "This is where he'll be hit. Hip smashed, ribs busted, head crushed, thrown down, dead into a ditch. Ka. And the end of Ka." So Roland, the character, is feeling the hurts that his creator will feel when he's struck dead. So why, Matt? What's going on here?
I don't know. I mean, like, okay, it's so difficult to talk about this book now because it's like, okay, well, okay, the actual answer is that the accident happened and injured King in a specific way, and he's now making his character feel these hurts. But then, like, okay, within the story, why is this happening within the story? And it's like, okay, well, there's magic. It's a premonition. It's a precognitive, inkling of what's going to happen to his creator, his father, and because they have some kind of magical connection via the beam, perhaps.
Sure.
And it's like. And I want to synthesize those two things into one answer that is coherent and makes sense, but it's because that's the fun of meta, right? The fun of meta is that, like, especially in a story like this, it's like both at the same time are true in a way that is almost like an Ouroboros. They reinforce each other, or they inform each other. But I don't have beyond that kind of fumbling sketch. I don't know why.
Yeah. I mean, so. I don't like talking about King's personal life because I think the thing we need to make absolutely clear here is that Stephen King, the character in the story, is still indeed a character, right? Mm-hmm. He is not Stephen King, the real person. He is a version of Stephen King created by Stephen King. But I do know, like, I love it as just this literal manifestation of the concept that your characters are the parts of you. And the things that happen to you, right? Like Roland, I think, has always been a reflection of Stephen King, and I think the struggles with addiction, his kind of ongoing plotting nature, like he's always been a certain reflection of how Stephen King sees himself, and he puts a lot of who he is into this character. And I think a lot of the conversations they had last book about how Roland kind of scared him a little bit, and he didn't understand him, and he seemed so simple at first, but then got so complicated. Are reflections of that. So to literally manifest the idea that this accident had a huge effect on Stephen King, physically and mentally, and those pains are manifest in his character, and the representation of the mental manifestation is the physical pains, the physical feeling of it, I think is a wonderful concept. One of the things we haven't really mentioned in King's personal life is that post-accident, he did suffer from an addiction to the painkillers that he was on. So he kind of sort of, I guess you can call it that a relapse. He fell back into drug abuse. It was his specific painkillers. And he had to get out of that again. So, I mean, that's another way in which we could see Roland's quest for the tower here at the end kind of falling back into a reflection of King.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's interesting. And I guess at this point, I'm just wanting to see if that goes anywhere further, or if we see more inklings of that within the story. But sure. That's a very interesting thing to kind of just note for now and pay attention to. I thought of another interesting. You were making comparisons between Roland and King just now, and I was thinking about, like, well, one interesting thing is that, like, it's like, okay, but King is not this guy he's not a guy who just, like, kills people. Like, that's not a trait of Stephen King. He doesn't murder people. And then I was like, well, wait a second, he's exactly like Roland when it comes to stories, in that Roland will kill anybody who's in his way to serve Ka, to serve the story, right? Mm-hmm. So will King.
Oh yeah,
King will, and if anything, King is a much greater monster than Roland if you're a character in his stories, because King has done all of the bad things in all of his stories, and he's killed all of the characters that you love and tortured them and brutalized them, and why? For Ka, to make the story better, right? So so they're both slaves of Ka in this way as well, under that particular interpretation of Ka.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I just started rereading King's book Bag of Bones, which is the one that was written still before his accident, but it's a book that I like pretty well. And this is not a spoiler really, because it happens in like the first page of the book, but the book basically starts with the main character's wife dying, just horribly dying from just a stupid brain aneurysm. Like nothing, like there's no point, there's no reason, there's nothing. She just dies. And then the rest of the book is him, you know, dealing with it. And then some crazy shit happens because it's a Stephen King book. But I love that perspective, because you're right. Like there's so much death in these books, and it's almost all just like, it's senseless and useless, and all it serves is the story itself, and it serves nothing else. Like there's very little poetic death. Sometimes it's just, oh, they died. I mean, it's like, we were talking about this when we talked about Needful Things, and we talked about, you know, our main character of that story, and his wife and kid died. They just died in a car accident, the end. And it's like, and that is used to inform what he goes through in that story. And it's just like, that happens again and again and again in Stephen King stories. So yeah, he's killed thousands of people. I mean, they're characters, but he, in that regard, he's killed just as many as Roland, because they're not real either. You know, like it's, I love this.
Yeah, he's killed all of the ones that Roland has killed too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Callahan's the only one I can think of where it's like, well, that was a heroic death. Like really all the others, even the ones, the ones, the people who died defending the Kala were, you didn't feel like it was heroic. You just felt like this sucks. Like, why'd this have to happen? This is awful.
Yeah, and it's not to say he doesn't have those heroic deaths. They certainly do happen, but I think they are on the rare side. I think King loves inspecting the aftermath of absolutely senseless death. Like, it's just like, there's no reason for this. There's no way to understand it on any level beyond just, well, we needed it to happen so the story could happen.
Yeah. And these things do happen too.
Yeah. Like, of course. Yeah, they do. But in a world that you could completely control, because you are Gan of this world, they don't have to, and yet they're going to, because Stephen King.
Yeah.
So the group decides that it will attempt to change Ka. It's going to try to save Stephen King. It has to, because Stephen King is the guardian of the last beam outside of our turtle and bear beam, Gan's beam. And if he goes, the beam goes. So they have to save him. But that gives them 2 missions, 2 targets, and they don't know which to do first. Should they ask Ted which first? No, Jake said. No, Oy agreed. Zero surprise there. If Ake said it, you could take to the Bumbler Bake, as far as Oy was concerned. Ask Sheemie, Jake said. Ask Sheemie what he thinks we should do. And that's the very dramatic ending of this very long first chapter of our 3 chapters this week.
Yeah. I like that. That was definitely a page turner of an ending. I was like, oh, yeah, thank God we get to keep reading.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to chapter 9, Tracks on the Path. The next chapter picks up early in the morning with Jake waking up from a dream he can't remember and setting out to look for Roland, who is squatting outside the cave, looking down at the Devar-Toi.
Yep, guess we'll never know what that dream was about.
Yep, never, ever, ever. So we get this moment where Roland shares a cigarette with his son. And I pulled this out just because this is one of the quotes the first time I read this book that really stuck out to me. He's low on tobacco, and Jake says, "Save it for yourself if you want." And Roland says, "A man who can't bear to share his habits is a man who needs to quit them," which is just fundamentally true, but also Roland.
Yeah, you're like, yeah, Roland. I mean, I guess he's sharing his tower hunting habit with everyone, so that's good of him.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But he also, of course, believes that smoking is good for you. So that's my favorite little mid-world tidbit. Eddie, come now. Smoking is good for you and prolongs life.
Well, it's they don't like technology over there. So
yeah.
They don't know what science is. They even have a word for cancer? I don't think they do. I think they call it something else.
Yeah, the twisty old man or something. Yeah.
I really love this part too. This whole chapter is very intimate father and son moments here, and I like this part. Roland reached out a finger and touched Jake's forehead, his left cheek, his nose, his chin. The last touch hurt a little. Pimples, Roland said. It's the air of this place. He suspected it was emotional upset as well, grief over the pair. But to let Jake know he thought that would likely just increase the boy's unhappiness over Callahan's passing. So, I mean, this is interesting because it is true that like being here messes, like they had this whole thing last week, right? Where like being here, the air here is rotten and it causes sores to break out. It causes pimples. It causes these things. But also, Matt, Jake's like coming up on the end of adolescence, right? He's probably starting to go through puberty, and these could literally just be the pimples that someone going through this period of their life get. This transition into manhood that's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess I did forget that he's basically pre-adolescent, verging on adolescence, right? So he wouldn't be normally like it's feasible that he wouldn't really be having pimples, but now he's starting to get them. Yeah, I like that. That's a good point. Something that Roland doesn't really think of, but I think is a valid interpretation.
Yeah, I like it. But also, it's just this really adorable moment, and Jake's like, "Well, you don't have any, Roland," and he's like, "Nope, not me." Which is why is this not affecting Roland's skin at all? We only see it on Jake's skin.
I keep feeling like Roland is like way more magical than he seems to be, because he like has lived for 1,000 years, and it's just kind of this like nothing affects him. Like, I mean, he got some fingers cut off, that's true, but he just always seems to just kind of bounce back and be the same as he always was.
Sure. We do also, I think this part right here kind of introduces us to the recurring motif of this chapter, which is Roland is keeping things from his quartet again. Like it's introduced kind of subtly here with a thing that isn't overly important, like to let Jake know that the pimples are probably caused from stress and grief related to how upset you are about the pair, and also probably about little Benny Slightman. And but like that's going to continue. By the end of the chapter, we have Roland telling his son to lie to everyone else about Mordred's location. So that's a big recurring beat that happens here. And like we're once again kind of removed from Roland's perspective for most of this chapter. And so like we don't get to see the full extent of the secrets he's keeping. Like how worried is he? What is he thinking? Like what's going on in his head is something King is hiding from us a lot.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the whole point of the chapter, right? Is what's going on in his head, because Jake has to like probe him to get him to tell him the truth.
Yeah. I guess so. It does remind me a lot of Wolves. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's happening now in Wolves is very reminiscent of the Roland failing to learn his lesson about not keeping secrets from the quartet. And yeah, he's doing it again. Absolutely.
And he's just doing it willy-nilly. And I think, like, you could argue Kashum, he senses the breaking of the quartet coming and is just like, well, then that's fine now. I'm on my own again. And so I'm kind of coiling back up in myself as I can sense this thing breaking down. Yeah,
maybe. I mean, yeah, that's a sad way of framing it, but I think maybe it's accurate. Yeah.
So Jake asks Roland why he's so angry and who he is angry at. And after a little mind battle game that Roland forces Jake to play, he finds out that Roland is mad at Stephen King, mad at him for stopping his work on the Dark Tower, but not just because King is scared. He's mad at him because he's lazy too.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out the mind battle thing as being really great because I think it's serving a double and probably also triple purpose in terms of writing. Because
Sure.
so yeah, we convey that Roland is mad at Stephen King. That's the superficial level. We also provide like a warm moment of father-son bonding in the midst of this story where, you know, being a teacher to Jake, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the final thing it does is it reminds us at a very, you know, necessary juncture of the story that Jake is hella psychic. He's you know, Roland says, yeah, you're psychic, kid, which may be very appropriate in the midst of the movement of the story that's about to come, because we're about to go into this den full of psychics and Jake is a psychic. And I just kind of think there's a good chance it's going to be relevant. Like we know Ted can kill people with his shining. And we're about to go fight a whole bunch of shiners. And so that might be relevant, right?
Sure. I think the existence of Mordred as an extremely powerful shiner, who like is more powerful than Thinking Cap's ability to resist him, I think is really important here too, because like it's there is a lot of conversation about protecting your mind. We have two very powerful children of Roland that are very powerful in the touch.
Yeah.
And so that seems to matter there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's yeah, I was just going to muse about how interesting it was that the story went out of its way to say that Mordred was going to let things play out, because obviously he could step in and fuck things up for either side, but he just sort of wants to watch the carnage, and that's interesting.
He just wants to watch the story. He just wants to read the book. Mordred.
Yeah. That would be fun if the whole rest of the story Mordred just followed them and was like, "This is fun," and then did nothing. Just yeah.
All right, we got to talk about the way Stephen King paints a picture of Stephen King.
Okay.
But I don't think it was fear that stopped him, Jake. Or not just fear. He's lazy as well. I felt it when I met him, and I'm sure that Eddie did too. He looked at the job he was made to do, and it daunted him. And he said to himself, all right, I'll find an easier job, one that's more to my liking and more to my abilities. And if there's trouble, they'll take care of me. They'll have to take care of me. And so we do. You don't like him? No, Roland agreed. I didn't. Not a bit, nor trusted him. I've met tale spinners before, Jake, and they're all cut more or less from the same cloth. They tell tales because they're afraid of life.
Burn on...
Sick burn on yourself?
Yourself and everyone who likes stories, maybe. It's interesting because, like, does Stephen King really feel like he himself is afraid of life? Like, does he feel like that's why he does this? I mean, there's a case to be made, sure. Like, you know, I use my fiction to grapple with the evil that I see, to get a handle on it and to get a sense of control over it. But also at the same time, this is not real. This is just telling stories, right? That's a kind of frame you can put on it. I don't know if he really feels that way or not. It's interesting though.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, you know, when we saw King in Song of Susanna, I got the feeling that this was a character, a construction of Stephen King that is the way an older, wiser gentleman looks back on who he was as a young man and is very critical of himself, right? Like, I think when we look back at it, like I look back at my teenage years, I look back at my college years, and I'm like, oh God, that fucking idiot down there who thought he knew everything and actually knew nothing and was stupid and lazy and took the easy way out. Like, I think that is very much what the character of Stephen King as we saw him in the 70s looked like. So I don't want to say that like Stephen King believes these things about himself. I do think he says, man, I was stupid back then. and I think I'm less stupid now, hopefully.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Yeah, I mean, but there is this interesting part where like King wrote Hearts in Atlantis instead of writing the next Dark Tower novel. And in the world, that was a mistake that cost him his life or almost cost him his life, whatever. And I wonder, like, it's very obvious that the accident that happened to Stephen King, one of the emotional effects of that accident was, oh my God, I died. I almost died before finishing this thing that I set out to do. And that's why it lit a fire under him. That's why he got these 3 books out within a few years of each other. That seems all why this happened. But and I think a lot of this, to get meta again, is an author reflecting on that central concept of like, holy shit, I almost died. And why did it take a near that death experience for me to finish this series? Why didn't I write these books? Why didn't I go back to Roland? Why didn't I tell those stories again? Why did I put them off? Why did I write this other book and this other book and this other book? Was it because they were easier? Was it because they were more in my comfort zone, and I didn't want to be challenged? And I don't know if he's like, by having Roland say these things, I don't know if he's saying they are unquestionably true, but I do think he's wrestling with these concepts in his head and he's putting them into his characters' voices.
Yeah, there's a shred of truth to it. And clearly after the accident, it seems like he polishes off the rest of the Dark Tower series in fairly short order, relatively speaking. I mean, he's a writing monster, right? But
yeah.
But yeah, like at least you can buy this idea that like, yeah, he has the accident and it's strongly motivating to him to be like, shit, I need to get this done. This is important. And I know this is important and I've been avoiding it because it's hard and it's daunting. Like that all sounds accurate to me. Like, yeah, I'm sure writing the Dark Tower is hard and daunting, even if there's no magical beam that's trying to channel through him. Like it's got to be hard to write something this long and complicated. And I'm waffling over whether to go into a personal digression here about like something that our friend Michael, who appears on some of our podcasts sometimes, did to me many years ago, which was incredibly motivating and has like created sustained motivation up until now. And I'll just very briefly summarize, but like we basically off and on have had a habit of like writing stories for each other to keep our writing habit going. And he wrote a story one time, and the story starts out, the frame is that the character in the story is me. It's Matt. Matt Freeman is in the story. I'm waiting for Michael to show up at like a coffee house so that we can work on our writing project together. And as the story goes on, like it's evident that like I'm much older in this story. We've had a very successful career as writers, and I'm like kind of looking back on the successful career that we've had. But over the course of the story, some details are off. And by the end of the story, it becomes evident that the Matt in the story is an old man suffering from dementia in a retirement home. Michael is dead, and we never actually accomplished anything. And those were all my delusions. And this was such a fucking devastating story to me because I was like, it's so horrifying, this idea, right? And the way it was written too was very compelling. It was like shocking to me. And I was like, well, I can't let that happen. And like that, this story has literally been a part of my motivation to like write and continue to write ever since then. I just wanted to share that because it was one of the more important stories I've ever read, honestly.
Yeah. No, I love that. I had actually never heard that story, so that's great.
Cool.
And I think it is not surprising to me that a person like Stephen King, who, as you've said, is a monster with writing, is such a prolific writer, is processing the way he feels about these things through his narrative as well. And it is to me the most fitting that the ones he chooses to most directly confront these feelings is the series that is arguably the most important to him, the one that spans his entire career, or spanned at that time his entire career. It fits so well, and I love it. I love it so much. There's so many things that I love about the Dark Tower. The turn it takes in these final 3 books to become a story about a man grappling with his mortality and his existence and what it means to create these stories and why they're important to him and to the world, and doing it in the most direct meta way is one of my favorite things about these books.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And clearly there's so many ideas that he considers to be important that he's just, it's not just the story, but he's like, well, I have to say what I need to say. There's
Yeah.
something he wants to say with the book. It's not just the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's, I mean, these are the ideas that we've been talking about this whole time, obviously.
So this part of the conversation done, Roland shows Jake the very clear Mordred tracks that he's discovered in the road, confirming that the spider baby was there last night and listened to their entire conversation. And then we get this delicious part. Jake was looking around. Is he watching us now? What do you think? Roland said, I think growing boys need their rest. Jake felt a twinge of some unpleasant emotion and put it behind him without much examination. Jealousy? Surely not. How could he be jealous of a thing that had begun life by eating its own mother? It was bloodkin to Roland, yes, his true son if you want to be picky about it, but that was no more than an accident. Wasn't it? I love Jake's jealousy of the fucking spider baby here, Matt. It's so perfect.
Yeah, just super jealous of this like truly pathetic and grotesque spider baby. This very, very realistic, very like kid touch here.
Yeah.
And it also highlights, this thing that exists between them, this possibility of conflict, of confrontation that we may see at some point.
I also really like the line. He put it behind him without much examination. Cue the next 5 seconds, 5 sentences being examination of that emotion.
Right. And evolving into a kind of lingering doubt that will doubtless worry him all night. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
But that was no more than an accident. And I love the paragraph break here. Sometimes, like, we've talked about this before, but the way in which literal words on page structure can help show tone and pace and timing, like that the paragraph break, wasn't it? It's just like a perfect way to instill perfect doubt in that whole thing.
Yep,
it's really wonderful. So Roland here decides that they shouldn't bother to tell Eddie and Susanna about their nightly visitor, and makes Jake promise to keep his mouth shut as well. And I think that is a very specific word usage too, because he says, "Will you keep your mouth shut?" Which is like a much more direct and rough way of saying don't tell other people. It's like it seems so much more rough to me.
Yeah, it's
your
rude.
Mouth shut.
I wouldn't say that to my son. I would unless I was obviously like joking around, right? Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, I just, my general note has been, I think my parents told me this when I was a little kid. They said, if an adult ever tells you to keep something secret from us, that means it's probably a bad thing. And so here's the adult Roland telling a kid, keep this secret from everybody else. Don't tell them.
Yeah.
You're just like, great.
Yeah. Right. I mean, once again, yes, Roland learned nothing from Wolves of the Kala. All of the stupid shit, avoidable damage that they underwent because they didn't tell each other things that they should have. Oh well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like I had, when you said he's learned nothing, I wanted to push back on that because I did think he learned, and then he just unlearned. And it seems like things are like echoing off themselves, right? Like he definitely learned that keeping secrets from his quartet was a bad idea. And then it's just like a new opportunity came up to keep secrets again. And he's like, whatever.
Yeah. I know what you mean, because it felt in that story like he came to some understanding, but I think that's kind of the problem with Roland is he just keeps going. And I mean, it's not a criticism of the book at all to say like Roland just has not grown very much. He's not grown zero, but he has not grown a lot. And you always sort of feel like he could regress at any time. Mm-hmm. Like we're still kind of worried that he's going to just sacrifice everybody and just be alone again. And like the fact that we can be worried about that tells you, okay, well, obviously he can't have grown that much, because if he had, then we would just be like, no, Roland would never do that now. So I know what you mean though. Like, I think he's just going, I think like you said a second ago, like he knows he knows that somebody's going to die, maybe multiple somebodies, and he's detaching, he's decoupling, he's either pushing them away or letting them drift away. And part of that is like, I don't really need to tell them this. That's not important.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't matter to what they need to accomplish now, because they're probably going to die. So,
yeah. God, I ever since the word Kef came into the story, I've just loved that as a metaphor for the notion that, like, if you're keeping secrets from your friends, that's harming your bond with them. And that's true in real life. There's no magic to it. It's just like, yeah, if you aren't able to communicate clearly if you know that there's a secret in your head, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like, I've become so aware of that ever since the book made it clear that I've actually, it's made me not more honest, because it's not like I was lying before, but just more likely to be like, so I'm going to share this with you because otherwise it'll be in my head, fucking up my ability to talk to you, you know?
Yeah. It just puts to words a feeling of the necessity of honesty.
Yes.
Yeah. I love it. All right, so we finished this chapter with the two heading back into the cave with some breakfast, and then Ted, Dinky, Sheemie, and our Child of Roderick friend that Roland asked to appear here the next morning show up, and then Sheemie has a seizure. And this is, I mean, it's so fitting that we were just talking about like Roland and learning and regressing, because we're introduced to these concepts, and I think King is wanting us to feel this way right now, because we're about to be introduced to a moment of, hey, Roland, you might have to sacrifice one of your like original friends, like one of the like way back members of your quartet. And it's such a wonderfully brilliant thing to introduce to us, and it's going to be in this next chapter, which I love so much. So let's move on to chapter 10, the last palaver, in parenthetical, Sheemie's dream. And before we talk about the chapter in detail, I just want to talk about this title, which I love to death. At this point in the story, we are almost exactly 500 pages from the end of the book and the end of the entire series. So we've still got quite a ways to go here. And the concept of palavers have been such an integral part of the book so far. We've had palavers from the very first book. Most of our storytelling that we were talking about at the beginning of this week's reading has been done in a palaver format. And King is kind of declaring here that this is it. This is the last one. We're done with the palavering after this, which is a bold declaration here, 500 pages from the end.
Yeah. It really gives a feeling of like, oh man, I don't know where the rest of this is going. You know, it feels like if there's a long series of books that have all been set on a train, and then the book is just like, this is the last chapter on the train. You're just like, wait, what does that mean? Where are we going? Because yeah, I mean, like you said, these little kind of points of contact with each other have been such a critical part of what the story is. So exciting.
Yeah. I was listening to the Kingcast podcast today. They had Ryan Johnson on talking about King's book on writing, which was like, I think there are no Dark Tower spoilers in it that you aren't aware of, Matt. So I think that's a safe one for you to listen to. It's a very talented screenwriter discussing what he learned from reading a book from a very talented writer, and it's one of the most fascinating podcasts I've ever listened to. It's absolutely wonderful. But one of the things that Ryan Johnson is talking about in that episode is the concept of King as a pantser type writer, as a non-structuralist who doesn't plan his stories out. He has his characters sometimes just like sit down and talk to each other about like, hey, what's next, as a way of feeling what the character's decision should be, as a way of feeling his way forward into what the next element of the story is going to be. And that's just a palaver, right? He just put the word palaver on this structure concept he has whenever he gets stuck in his story. And so it is kind of crazy that we're just not gonna have that anymore. And maybe that is fitting, because maybe as you approach the end of the book, like the what happens next slowly fades away and it becomes very clear where everything is going to go from this point on.
And it's not like there aren't going to be moments of people having conversations. I assume, but
no more dialogue.
No more dialogue. Yeah. Yeah, no, but like just the idea of like all of our heroes who are all on the same side coming together for a moment of quiet is going to be over.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A
no,
moment of quiet, or a moment of, okay, what next? A moment
Yeah.
of let's gather together and regroup and replan what we're going to be doing. Let's share some more information. Let's learn some new things. They're multifaceted, these palavers.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we're done with them. Done.
Mm-hmm.
So the start of the chapter is absolute chaos, with the rod bowing down before Roland and the rest of the folk rushing to Sheemie's side. Oi is like super defensive of Jake here, which is a really great beat.
Yeah, the oi beat is great. It reminds me of how dogs react whenever, anything happens around them.
Yeah. I mean, mine just runs away, but yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't pull it, but there are a lot of very interesting oi beats in this chapter. Like we start off the chapter, he's very, very, very defensive of Jake. And by the end of the chapter, he's off away from Jake, playing with the child of Roderick and playing with Sheemie off on his own, like bonding with these new people. And I think the text even makes a point where like Roland is like, oh, that might be troubling that Oi is not as around Jake as much. And we don't really know what to make of that. But the book stops to point that out multiple times throughout the course of the chapter.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know what to do with that yet. I mean, we've sort of had many notes over the course of the story that Oi is not necessarily open to just befriending anyone. Like he's Jake's buddy, and he'll tolerate everybody else. But he's just going off and he's just kind of hanging out and playing with these guys. I mean, it's interesting because these guys are also psychic like Jake, so maybe on some level he's able to interact with them on a deeper wavelength. I mean, maybe he's a psychic Billy Bumbler, maybe he can actually tune into them in a way beyond just normal people. Who knows? I don't know. That could be just complete BS, but that is one thing they have in common. Oh no, sorry. Roderick, the child of Roderick is not psychic. So that's not a thing, but I don't know, whatever.
Yeah. I think, I mean, part of what I think it's trying to do is you're nervous for every single member of the quartet, right? Like King has been very direct that, hey, someone's probably going to die. Who's it going to be? And then like everything that's changing is like does Oi sense that Jake's about to die? And he's like, okay, I'm going to find a new friend. We don't want to believe that because it's fucking Oi, but I think the text is inviting us to question these things and wonder. And it's part of the whole tension building of the fellowship is going to break, and it will be because we will lose someone.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right.
So it's only until Roland begins to whisper into his ear that Sheemie calms down, and we get this absolutely beautiful scene here. 5 minutes later, Sheemie opened his eyes, sat up, and looked around with the bewildered air of one who knows not where he is, how he got there, or why. Then his eyes fixed on Roland, and his poor, tired face lit in a smile. Roland returned it and held out his arms. Can he come to me, Sheemie? If not, I'll come to you, sure. Sheemie crawled to Roland of Gilead on his hands and knees, his dark and dirty hair hanging in his eyes, and laid his head on Roland's shoulder. Susanna felt tears stinging her eyes and looked away. Oh man, Roland's relationship with Sheemie here is it's just beautiful, Matt. It's almost like it feels out of time here. Like it feels like this is coming from a different version of Roland. Like he's fatherly to Sheemie here, but it's not in the same way he is to Jake. Like the last chapter was a Jake Roland chapter, and Jake talked about how he went on this thing about how everything with Roland is a test. Roland is testing you constantly. He's making sure you're learning. That is not how he treats Sheemie. Sheemie, he's just kindly to, and just generous and loving, and like he does love Jake. I'm not saying he doesn't love Jake, but it feels like a unique relationship, and one we don't see current Roland have very often.
Yeah. It's much. He's sort of treating Sheemie like he'd treat a small child or someone where he's not trying to sculpt Sheemie into a killer, right? He's valuing Sheemie's innocence actually,
Yeah.
That's it's really, it really, yeah. I mean, the messed up thing, of course, is that we're sort of setting up to have a potentially bad situation happen with Sheemie, right?
Right. I mean, that's what this is doing, right? That's all part of the plan, right? Because this is the chapter that we learned that every time Sheemie teleports, he is hurting himself, but we're going to need him to teleport over to Maine to save Stephen King, and this might kill him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, right before we define that, we're going to remind all of our readers and all of our Tet and Roland himself of how beautiful this relationship between these two men are. It's just mean. It's just mean.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's mean. It's what this story is doing for sure. Like, established Roland really does love Sheemie. It's not an act. Established that he absolutely will use up Sheemie to further his goals. In the same chapter, actually. I mean, that's the next bit, right? And another thing, that I just wanted to mention plot wise and how this all kind of fits together is like the mission here is not to get to the tower. The mission here is to save the beams. So obviously, and you've argued this before, saving the beams is necessary to getting to the tower, because if the beams fall, then there's no tower. But but also, like, this feels less exploitative and psychopathic than Roland's actions sometimes can, because, like, hey, if the beams break, then Sheemie will die along with everything else. So like, it doesn't feel good, but you can see the argument that, like, look, we need Sheemie to do everything he possibly can do, because he might survive this way, whereas if the beams break, none of us will.
Sure, absolutely.
Which is it's the sort of argument that is very uncomfortable to make, but it's obviously the one that Roland is making in his mind, at least.
Totally 100% fair.
Mm-hmm.
The possibility that I will introduce, and I am not saying that this is the way things are going to shake out, but that they defeat the master of the Devar-Toi.
Mm-hmm.
They stop the breakers. They save the turtle beam. They teleport to Maine, and they save Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
And Sheemie's still alive.
And then they say, "Now take us to the tower."
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
And the question we need to be asking ourselves in this moment is, would Roland do that? And I don't think we've seen a reason why not.
Yeah.
I don't think we've seen it. And that doesn't mean he's going to. Again, I'm just offering hypotheticals here.
Mm-hmm.
But it is certainly possible. And I think these are the things that are popping into our head as we see this beautiful relationship, which, I mean, Roland is kind of facilitating Sheemie in a way here, right? Like, we have this beautiful word defined during the Ted Brodigan story of facilitating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he even mentions that, like, when the breakers would get red, would lose themselves a little, he would whisper, he would murmur into their ear to calm them down. And that is exactly what Roland is doing for Sheemie here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, almost identically. He even, like, we don't get to see what he murmurs into his ear. We hear a little bit about Will Dearborn that was and all these other things, but that's what he does here. He facilitates him to calm him. Which is beautiful, but if it's for his larger purpose of using him to get to the tower, then yeah, we stop feeling good about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love the situation you framed for me, and it's fun to think about, even if that's not the way the plot goes.
Mm-hmm. But we see here that Eddie follows Dinky outside the cave to get a little more intel on Sheemie. They talk about how his teleports are causing strokes of the surface of his brain and how they're getting worse. And I gosh, speaking of everything we just talked about, I love this part. I hate using him that way, Dinky burst out. He kept his voice pitched low so those in the cave wouldn't hear, but Eddie never for a moment considered that he was exaggerating. Dinky was badly upset. He doesn't mind. He wants to do it, and that makes it worse, not better. The way he looks at Ted. He shrugged. It's the way a dog to look at the best master in the universe. He looks at your din the same way, as I'm sure you've noticed. He's doing it for my din, Eddie said, and that makes it okay. You may not believe that, Dink, but you do. So this is an interesting and classical gunslingery way of just moralizing away your problems with any of the usage of people here, right?
Yeah.
And I think, like, so this is a moment in which Henry Dean returns to our story, right? Like, Eddie just says this thing like, he's doing it for Roland, and because he's doing it for Roland, that makes it okay, regardless of any reservations you have of it. And then Henry Dean pops up and it says, "Who you trying to cheer up, bro?" Henry spoke up suddenly inside his head, cynical as always. "Him or yourself?" And I just think that's a great moment for Stephen King to reintroduce the Henry Dean voice.
Absolutely. Eddie hasn't been too much the focus this week so far, but I think he deserves some attention here because Eddie's obviously not entirely comfortable with what's happening with Sheemie and what seems like it's going to happen with Sheemie. And it's interesting that it's the Henry voice that articulates this discomfort. It reminds me very much of the beat from a while back where Eddie reflects on how, like, he doesn't think he could possibly go back to the real world. That, like, he's musing that something within him has degraded or deteriorated. Like, he couldn't sit through a movie anymore. And here we have an Eddie who he can't really even raise moral objections to the mission of the quartet, even if he feels reservations. The only sign we even get that he feels reservations is the Henry voice. Of course, this is all my interpretation of what's happening and what that means, but I don't know. I feel like that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the text is kind of opening you to make your own interpretation, because the interesting thing about this thing to me is that Eddie doesn't really question why Henry is suddenly making a reappearance in his head. This is a part of Eddie that he seemed to have moved beyond a while ago. That the Henry Dean voice used to be this constant presence in his head earlier in the story, and then as Eddie has grown and matured, he's heard Henry less and less. He's become less of a fixture in his life as he's grown beyond him. And yet he appears here and Eddie doesn't question it. Eddie doesn't question why Henry's here, why this voice made this. He doesn't go into the fact that he's just explaining away the using of this person in a rather simplistic term.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I don't know. It's all this sort of stuff makes me to say worried about Eddie seems simplistic, because I've been worried about Eddie for a long time. It makes me more worried. It makes me concerned. It makes me feel like Eddie's losing his grasp on something important. I don't know how to articulate more clearly than that, because again, the story isn't giving us much to go on. There's not a whole lot of Eddie here. But yeah, I don't know. Well, I'm interested to see kind of how he conducts himself in what's to come. Like is Eddie now basically the kind of guy who's just going to, like, lock all these breakers into a wooden building and burn them alive, like, and not even, like, feel any qualm about it? Like, is that the sort of character he is becoming or has become?
Sure.
And yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm completely off base. I'm getting this vibe for sure from the way Eddie is behaving and thinking here.
No, that's good. I think obviously we could have had this conversation about the state of Sheemie with any other character. King chose Eddie to have this in this moment, so it seems significant. So I think questioning that stuff is good. We can put a pin in that and maybe come back to it as we continue on with Eddie.
Yeah, cool.
So at last we get back to Sheemie and the question that Jake said they needed to ask him: which should they save first? Which beam should they save first? And I love here that Roland forces Jake to ask the question. It's like part of his whole constant lesson form of fathering to him. Is like, well, you're the one that said it, so you should be the one that asked it. So he forces Jake to do it, even though he has a much closer relationship with Sheemie than Jake does. But that's just Roland for you.
Yep, always pushing.
Yep. So he asked the question, which did they say first, the writer or the breakers? And in response, Sheemie tells him about his dream. He's back in the Traveler's Rest, and a boy walks in. A boy that looks a lot like Jake, but beat up. And this boy is begging Sheemie. I, Will Dearborn that was, right at me. So he did, and said, why must you hurt me when I love you so, when I could do nothing else nor want to, for love made me and fed me and kept me in better days, Eddie murmured. A tear fell from one of his eyes and made a dark spot on the floor of the cave. And kept me in better days. Why will you cut me and disfigure my face and fill me with woe? I have only loved you for your beauty as you once loved me for mine in the days before the world moved on. Now you scar me with nails and put burning drops of quicksilver in my nose. You have set the animals on me, so you have, and they have eaten off my softest parts. Around me the Cantoi gather, and there's no peace from their laughter. Yet still I love you and would serve you and even bring the magic again if you would allow me. For that is how my heart was cast when I rose from the prim. And once I was strong as well as beautiful, but now my strength is almost gone. So this is the beam, Matt. This is a dream in which the beam comes to them and tells them that it's not in good shape. And they realize they all had this dream at the same time, only they forgot about it until Sheemie began to tell it. The beam is making it clear what must be their priority. The breakers first, then the writer. This is such an interesting choice here that Stephen King makes, I think, because we learn that they all had this dream and they all were in significant places in their lives. And Roland, the place he had the dream was also at the Traveler's Rest himself. And it just goes back to this idea that so much of who Roland is and was is defined by his time back in Hambry. And that shows why Sheemie's so important to him. And it's so complicated what's happening here.
The whole dream, the retelling of it hit me really powerfully on an emotional level. And then, of course, there's all sorts of plotty things to talk about. I mean, the personification of the beam as this conscious, angelic being of pure love and pure forgiveness, visualized as an innocent child that's been maimed. It really makes the mission emotional and urgent in an immediate way that it wasn't before, because before it was like, save the beam, save the universe. Yeah, sure, whatever. We're always saving the universe in stories, aren't we? Oh, save this poor magical child angel. Oh, I'm all in. Shit. Absolutely, right? Like it sells you on an emotional level really effectively.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, I love the detail that it looks a little bit like Jake.
Yeah.
And so there's this irony of the fact that is a Jake lookalike saying, why do you do this to me? Why do you hurt me? And to save that beam, what did Roland do to another small boy? There's so much here.
Yeah. That's interesting.
I couldn't get over this time around, especially the idea that everyone tells where they were in their dream. And Roland says, the Traveler's Rest, of course I was back there, back in Magus. And like, Roland has lived a long, long time, has seen very many things. He's not back in Gilead. He's back and he's playing castles with Jonas, right? Like that's where he's doing when he has this dream. And I don't know, it really affected me that this is the defining moment of Roland's life to him, and that's why in this dream that's where he is. That's where he appears.
Yeah. Well, he hasn't moved on. Yeah. He hasn't moved on from that, right? He's still fighting those demons, still carrying that sin with him, right? And he still hasn't forgiven himself for all of that, right? Like when the Katet tried to tell him, you know, it's funny. We just talked about the idea that the Katet know the difference between accidental killing and not. But the Katet tried to tell him, like, hey, Roland, like you killing your mother was an accident, you know, which was not in Hambry, but was adjacent to it.
Sure.
And he was like, you know, he just dismissed that. Like, he's like, no, I'm not going to forgive myself for that, right? So none of this. So yeah, he's very much still this kid in the Traveler's Rest. Yeah, it's great.
It is. And then we get this wonderful quote from Jake. I wonder if Stephen King ever uses dreams in his writing. as yeast to make the plot rise. Said the Stephen King character talking about dreams in a Stephen King book.
Right, that they had just had. Yeah. It's funny. I don't know whether King uses dreams a lot in other books, but they've definitely figured a lot into this story.
Yeah, I mean, it's the ultimate of irony, and I think Jake is being intentionally cheeky here because they know they're in a book.
Uh-huh.
So the answer is obviously yes. If a dream just came to you,
right,
to help make the plot rise.
Yeah.
So with their path decided, breakers first, writer second, the conversation switches to the task at hand, the attack of the Algul Ciento. Stop the breakers, kill them if you have to. I love, you're absolutely right that this is setting up the potential for cruelty here, because King has spent so long defining these people as people and not good people. Like, they called them assholes, they called them isolated people, they called them people that would knowingly carry on with what they were doing just to keep on keeping on. And yet they're just people, and they're just people that have been fooled and isolated and ostracized and ended up here.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of opportunity for cruelty with how the Khated is going to deal with these people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it seems like King was either very affected by, or at least recognized the themes he was talking about in the true event of the Jim Jones, I guess massacre is the word. But that was a situation where a large number of people were killed, and you can put a goss of they committed suicide, but I don't know if it's actually clear whether they knew what they were doing. I don't think it is necessarily. But
so hard to tell with that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I think at least some of them did not. But the point being, feels like that's a situation that we're actually headed toward, and a whole bunch of people getting killed, because that reference was made, to sort of frame the situation for us, right?
Sure. So, yeah. The one thing we learn here is that Sheemie has to stay out of the fighting, because they can't risk him getting hurt. Not because Roland particularly cares about him, but because if they win, they're going to need Sheemie to take them to Maine. And I love this part right here. "We know," Roland said, "and when the time comes, I'll make the risk clear and ask him if..." "Oh man, you can stick that one where the sun don't shine," Dinky said, and Eddie was reminded so strongly of himself, the way he'd been during the first few hours on the shore of the Western Sea, confused, pissed off, and jonesing for heroin, that he felt a moment of deja vu. If you told him you wanted him to set himself on fire, the only thing he'd want to know would be if you had a match. He thinks you're Christ on a cracker. I love how Dinky just calls him immediately out on this bullshit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I start to wonder, is Dinky the twin of Eddie? That they kind of have similar sounding names, similar dispositions, similar-ish way of talking, sort of serving similar roles in their own quartets. And, Dinky here is saying stuff that I feel like Eddie would have been saying like a book and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
But now Eddie has drunk the Roland Kool-Aid, to mix my metaphors, and is no longer capable of kind of calling their own morality into question.
Yeah, I think you're totally right here. I mean, I think the relationship between Dinky and Eddie, whether they are twims or not, like textually,
mm-hmm.
they are reflections of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the conversation between the two of them was meant to draw this reflection. And I think this is the end of that idea, that we've come to a point where Dinky is being exactly what Eddie used to be. And
mm-hmm.
that has the effect of making both us and Eddie realize, oh shit, I've changed.
Yeah.
And shouldn't I be the one arguing about how this is cruel and mean, and how we're clearly just using this person? But
absolutely.
No, I'm with Roland now.
Because what? Yeah. I mean, just again, like, you can literally imagine Eddie saying, "You can stick that where the sun don't shine," Roland. Such a perfect
right.
Eddieism.
Yeah. But that's not the Eddie we see in this book.
Yep.
Anymore.
Yep.
We have this quote that I wanted to talk about as we finish the reading for this week. She thought of asking Ted if there was any way of telling what day it was in America right now, then decided not to bother. If Stephen King was dead, they'd know. Roland had said so, and she had no doubt he was right. For now, the writer was fine, happily frittering away his time and valuable imagination on some meaningless project, while the world he'd been born to imagine continued to gather dust in his head. If Roland was pissed at him, it was really no wonder. She was a little pissed at him herself. But now we have to go back to the one truth of this whole thing is that the work that we were explicitly told in the Walter O'Dim chapter that King chose to work on instead of finishing The Dark Tower was the 1999 novel Hearts in Atlantis, and therefore Ted. Mm-hmm. So if Ka is rejecting King because King is rejecting the song, but he's working on a story that brings Ted to life, and Ted is a key part of that battle, then, well, what?
maybe the way that you have to save King is you have to somehow communicate to him the idea that this character, Ted Brodigan, he's thought of, would make a really great addition to the Dark Tower. And then suddenly Ka is like, oh, okay, I'll accept that.
All is forgiven. Yeah.
Right.
The only way that story would matter is if you find a way to link it back to the Dark Tower. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. It's such a perfect like brain twister a little bit though, because back in Walter O'Dim's chapter, he's so confident that Stephen King is fucked because he started working on Hearts in Atlantis, but Hearts in Atlantis suddenly has become incredibly important to what's going on in this book.
Yeah.
And it's just a fascinating turn. I really love it.
It is interesting to think about the idea that in reality, in real life, I'll bet that the Dark Tower was this important kind of heavy, daunting, difficult, demanding thing, and that King did need to take breaks from it. But even when he's taking the breaks, maybe it's tugging at the back of his mind, God, I need to finish that thing. There's people waiting for me to finish that thing. He can't quite get himself to work on it necessarily, but okay, well, maybe here's a Dark Tower adjacent story. It's safer. It's just a novella, no sweat, no pressure. It's not really part of the Dark Tower, and then it's easy to get himself to work on that.
Sure.
And the beam says no. Work on the real Dark Tower.
I'm gonna send a van to hit you and almost kill you.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the end of our chapter. They formulate their plan. We don't really get a lot of details of what their plan is. King seems to be saving most of this. We know that it's going to have something to do with Susanna and the mobility she has on her 3-wheel trike thing, but we don't know much beyond that. We know that they will succeed, though, because Roland says matter-of-factly, just like he did to John Cullum, is because it's the only way. Yeah. There's nothing else. And that's how we end it. So how you feeling about this battle, Matt? You feeling good?
Well, I mean, not really. I mean, I think they're going to succeed in saving the beam, because otherwise the story would become very strange. But I think that a lot of terrible things are going to happen.
Cool. We will find out soon. All right, we are running way long, and we've got a ton of answers to last week's discussion questions. So why don't we jump right into it before we wrap this thing up?
Cool.
Last week's question was, what book gave you the greatest sense of costume? And like I said, Matt, I guess people really enjoyed this question. I really enjoyed the question too, because so many of y'all sent in answers, and I fell in love with all of them. So we're going to go through these as quickly as we can, but I also have a lot to say about all of them. So
yeah.
It's tough.
Sorry if we give them short shrift, but
yeah.
So Anonymous says, I definitely felt it in book 4, Wizard in Glass. By reading the first 3 books, I could gather, like everyone else, that Roland's old friends were all dead. So I was at first eager to see how those death storylines would play out in Wizard in Glass, and I assumed the story would involve Alan and Cuthbert's demise. It was more curiosity at first, just to find out how it happened. But as I kept reading book 4, I started to become unsure of my new theory, grew to like Alan and Cuthbert more and more, and became more worried than curious about them. As you know, they both lived to fight another day. For non-Stephen King Kashum, I'd say Peter Straub's Ghost Story. You guys will likely read The Talisman and Black Horse in season 2. The Ghost Story really shows Straub deserves accolades on his own. It was such a deep, layered story. Long story short, it's spoiler-free. 5 friends do something not so good as young men and find themselves paying it back with interest as seniors. It's in a small town, snowy in wintertime, and is gothic in the best modern sense of the word. Stephen King wrote a lengthy essay on Ghost Story in the nonfiction book Dance Macabre. It's really great. Cool.
Yep, it is.
Have you read?
I have not read Ghost Story.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I have not. I have read the essay on it in King's book.
Cool.
I have not read much Peter Straub. Actually, I think the only Peter Straub I've read is Talisman and Black House. I think that's it. So I need to Peter Straub. I've enjoyed his writing in those two, so I need to read some more. But I liked the idea of Elaine and Cuthbert, and it made me think that Kashum is almost just giving word and definition to King's propensity to say, and that was the last time anyone ever saw this person, right? It's his desire to tell you what's going to happen before it happened, and so you feel that loss before it actually comes,
and layer in with whatever is happening the feeling of foreboding, dread, even excitement, because he can make it seem exciting too. Yeah.
Idolan Jones says, I can think of 2 books that gave me incredible costume. The first is The Amber Spyglass, the last book in the His Dark Materials trilogy. I won't spoil it because it remains one of the most powerful endings I've ever read, but the moment when the main characters realize just what they have to do to save the world, the sacrifice they'll have to make, is just heartbreaking. The build-up to that as a reader slowly pushes the pieces together and figures it out is pure costume. The second is a more meta example. Terry Pratchett's last book, The Shepherd's Crown, came out a few months after he died, right around my birthday. I got a special slipcover hardback that I have never even opened. Sir Terry was the first author whose work I ever read, excluding children's book, and has influenced on my taste in fiction, my own writing, and the way I see the world is simply immense. There's no way I could enjoy his last book without feeling costume the whole way through. So for now, it remains unread. That's really cool. I like that kind of literal spin on it.
I relate to that because there are authors that I love where I haven't read some of their books because I'm like, then I'll be done. If I read them, I'll be done, and then I won't have any more. Yeah. And that's sad.
I mean, not to get too morbid, but there is this idea that is in the back of my mind, and I think Scott Wampler touched on it, that he hasn't read all the most recent King books because he wants to keep a repository of books he hasn't read, because King is a man that's getting older and he's not going to live forever, and there's eventually going to be the last Stephen King book I will ever read, and that's going to be really hard for me. And I might do a similar thing to Idolan Jones here, where like starting that final book is not going to be easy.
Yeah, you're making me all emotional over here, man.
Yeah.
We need to solve this whole death thing.
Yeah, let's figure out a way to stop that from happening.
Any day now. All right, Megafire7 says, the closest they came to feeling costume was during Worm's final arc, Spec. I mean, 100% me too. And if I remember our episode on that arc, or our episodes on that arc, I'm pretty sure that you did too.
Yeah, that's where I almost cried into a microphone, which was a weird experience for me. But that was a very emotional conversation. And we can't say anything more about it. I would not take that away from anyone. But it's beautiful. RL Raider says Wildbow's web serial Twig is costume. This is the one I haven't read, so this is fun information for me. At the very start of the story, we're introduced to the fact that everyone on the team has an expiration date. About a third of the way into the story, we see what it looks like as one of the main characters is nearing theirs. And by the second third of the story, I had to take an extended break because of all the costume. Twig doesn't get enough love, and I think it's because it's Bow's most emotionally draining work.
It's true. Yeah. That was a very deft pirouette around some spoilers there, RL Raider. But I agree. Like the idea of telling you at the beginning of the story, it's the equivalent of saying like, these characters, expiration date literally means, a day where they're destined to die, right? It's like, well, that's you're definitely telling me this story is going a certain direction.
Yep.
Maybe we can avert it, right? Like you want to avert it, but it gives you this. It immediately starts you off on your back foot in that way, and it keeps you there basically. So
sure.
Complicated 9519 says they'd say the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. I don't want to give out reasons because Matt needs to read that right now. The story is so full of imminent death, especially when tied to the later stories, The Outsider and If It Bleeds. I'd also give the movie Jurassic Park, The Lost World. I knew the second Eddie Carr tried to save everyone from the trailers being tossed over the ledge, that he would die, and well, he died a hero. Much better than the death he got in the book. I don't remember what death he got in the book, but yeah, it was a sacrifice. It was a good sacrifice.
The book is very different. I think he dies, a lame, like just nothing death. In the book.
Yeah.
Squatch42 says, I hope you would indulge me in not answering your discussion question and answering my own. All right. When I think of costume, the first thing that came to my mind isn't from a book or a movie. Oddly enough, it's a piece of music, The Shape of Things to Come by Bear McCreary from the soundtrack of the 2004 version of Battlestar Galactica. The emotional response of this piece has always stirred within me, is fully described in costume. It makes me feel this peace in the moment, but some heartbreaking inevitability in the future. Knowing that triumph is a package delivery on a railway of suffering and regret. Knowing the wheel of Ka won't stop spinning for you to mourn your losses or celebrate your triumphs. The melody just keeps pushing you forward, and I swear I can feel my heart start spinning instead of beating when I hear it. That's beautiful. I love that.
It's beautifully written too. That's really interesting. Yeah. It's really funny because I'd never heard of Bear McCreary until a couple of months ago, maybe. And now we actually listen to Bear McCreary in my household all the time because he did the soundtrack for the 2018 God of War video game. And it's
which,
just,
if you listen to any of Matt's talking on anything in the past month, it's somehow involved in that video game.
Somehow worked that in. Did it here too. Gotta get it everywhere. I love that game. The soundtrack is beautiful. Even my kids love the soundtrack. They play the soundtrack on the piano. It's so good. That's cool though. I mean, music's power to create emotion is of course a cheat code.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing I wish I could get better at as a podcaster and an analyzer of film is my ability to talk about music and the way it works. I love music. I love the way in which soundtracks can completely sell a moment to you and make it 20 million times more emotional than it ever would have been. But I just don't have the ability to talk about that in any kind of intelligent way. I always just kind of revert back to, it was really good.
Yeah.
So I just kind of avoid talking about soundtracks on any of our analysis. And I wish I could do better with that.
Well, if it's sad, just say the minor key song was really effective, and then everyone will be like, "Yeah, he's right." All right,
I got a cheat code. I'm going to use it.
Groovy Cheese 6969 says they're going to reach and throw a bone to their other all-time favorite series, Dune, particularly Book 4 and the relationship the God Emperor has to humanity via the Golden Path. Leto II assumes his role as super predator and ultimate aristocrat for over 3,000 years while patiently nurturing the seeds of his own demise. Magic. Sonia, Nala, Duncan, Maneo, and Huinori all grapple with Kashum throughout the book, some even longing for it. Hell, even Leto longs for some break in his unchanging and dominant existence. When it does finally happen, the universe will never be the same. The Golden Path endures. The scope of the Dune series still marvels me to this day. I know Matt enjoys finding Lord of the Rings parallels in The Dark Tower, but there are many Dune similarities too. Awesome. I mean, I love Dune too. I've not read all of the Dune books, but I love particularly the first one. And I can't say that I've noticed that many Dune parallels in The Dark Tower, but now that you've pointed it out, I will pay more attention. So thank you.
Great. Now we're going to have a Dune section every week.
Yep. Yes, we are. We didn't even have Lord of the Rings. Go ahead.
Yeah, we didn't this week. I've only read one Dune. I've only read the first Dune novel.
Yeah, they get
one
weird.
Day I'll read some more Dune. Yeah, I've heard enough.
Yeah.
I think I should just stop when Herbert stops writing them, right? That's
No, I think that's fair. Yes.
Felidao says the Cimmerillion, I can't speak, gives me the very powerful feeling of costume, though strictly speaking, there isn't one particular katet that gets broken. It's more like the entire world is slowly and inexorably crushed beneath the accumulated weight of a millennia of tragedy, sorrow, and war. The greatest heroes of elves and men perish one by one in the endless wars against the North. The brilliant love stories, such as Beren and Luthien, are swallowed by the darkness. The glory of ancient kingdoms fade, and one is left with nothing more than the leaden, inescapable feeling that the world has, dare I say it, moved on.
It's great.
That's really wonderful. They go on to talk about how King's Towerverse and Tolkien's Middle-earth share this central idea of that older is better, which is like a recurring idea of fantasy, that like we've left the older, better ways behind, and we can never get them back again. I think that's absolutely true. Like that both series share that common thread.
Yeah, the golden age. And it is interesting because for a long period of time, the world was this way, because it was like everything sucked compared to Rome. It's like Rome was this amazing thing that everything like it was really only in the last few hundred years that things became good again. Anyway,
which is why I think this is such a common recurring beat in this kind of fantasy type storytelling, because it's reaching back to a viewpoint that existed for a very long time, where people just assumed that nothing was ever going to be good again.
Yeah.
that there's no better to look forward to.
Yeah. Cool.
Which is a bummer. I'm glad we've moved beyond that as a society.
Me too.
And a species.
We've moved on, but in a good way.
Yes.
Pear Jane says, I had a feeling this would be the question, and I have one answer. World's End in the Sandman series. When I saw how the series would end and I realized it was coming to a close, I sobbed. Like legit got in the shower and cried ugly tears so no one would hear how sad I was at the loss of both a character and the series end. Several years before, one of my best friends entered the room shell-shocked, saying, I just realized the comic series I've been reading for 7 years is over. He introduced Sandman to me, and at the time I didn't get how devastated he was. Time passed, and I read them all, got to World's End, and thought of that moment when Mac came in the room, and then cried my ugly tears in the shower. Wow. When somebody tells me that something affected them that much, I'm like, I don't know if I want to read it, because that sounds like it's going to hurt.
Man, I'm the exact opposite, where I'm like, I got to read this right now. No, I've read the first volume of Sandman, and I really enjoyed it, and I have no good excuse for why I haven't read more. I love Neil Gaiman, so there's literally no reason for me not to be reading these, other than their comics, and I just don't read comics as much.
Yeah, I'll get around to them.
Next up, we have Man of Zimmer, who says favorite costume moment from a book was from Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. Is it Follett or I don't know. Like Matt, I am an audiobook consumer, and when this book finally ended after something like 40 plus hours, my only thought was, wait, that's it? There's no more? If you haven't read the book, it spans 3 generations of life. We meet our characters as children and follow them through adolescence, adulthood, and old age, so you really get attached. When it was over, I felt a real sense of loss. They highly recommend all of these books.
Awesome. I don't really think I know much about those, but that makes me curious. So thank you. The Amazing Duck 42 says the last part of the story of Brian K. Vaughan's comic series Saga. They say it's Romeo and Juliet meets Star Wars meets Game of Thrones, and the reader knows from the first page of the book that our protagonist's story will not end well. Doesn't stop you from falling in love with the characters. The sense of foreboding and growing tension as the breaking of the unit approaches inevitably on the horizon really serves to highlight the gut-wrenching, devastating end of the series. It is such a masterful story about love and family and how being good people doesn't necessarily mean you win in the end. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend. 10 out of 10 would cry again.
A lot of crying comics today.
Yeah.
I guess Romeo and Juliet would be a pretty good costume example.
Yeah, for sure.
Like the first line of the story is a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
Yeah.
So we know they gonna die.
Yeah.
We're just waiting for it. Unplugged Gem says, for a series outside the King universe, I'd have to say Kingkiller Chronicles. You start with Kavath in a pub, seemingly without any kind of powers or abilities beyond the average dude. Then you flash back to when he was a kid and did all this crazy stuff. The series is set up to basically get you thinking, what happened to make him hide in a pub, and where are all his best friends? His university quartet is bound to break, and it's just a matter of finding out how, if we ever do get Doors of Stone, which I'm not holding my breath for.
I'm still trying to hold my breath, but
well, we're very recent converts, so we haven't even been holding our breath very long on this. Yeah, I adore these books. We did the first book, Name of the Wind, for book club a couple years ago, and I think both you and I like immediately read Wise Man's Fear, and I think like these books are very different from the Dark Tower series. Like Patrick Rothfuss is a different kind of writer entirely than Stephen King, I think. But the joy I felt while reading those reminded me of the first time I read the Dark Tower. I haven't enjoyed reading a series as much as I've enjoyed reading those. I think they're excellent books, and I do still think that Rothfuss is doing very, very interesting things with the concept of storytelling in these novels.
Sure.
And the reason I want to see the end of the series beyond just I enjoy reading them is because I think the conceit of what he's saying about storytelling will be revealed as the story wraps up. And I just really want to see it. I really do.
Yeah. And the meta layer also does remind me of the Dark Tower.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, very like one of the most entertaining things I've ever read. Definitely. I very strong recommend there. In fact, Kingkiller was going to be one of my things that I mentioned at the end if nobody else had mentioned it, but Unplugged Gem did mention it. So
good.
Shortstop 88 says they don't generally feel it in books, not until the end, but there are times in the past that they felt Kashum. They say, I thought of these as soon as the explanation was given in this episode. I felt it in the final episode of Community after I had binged the series to make up for my last year of college being cut short due to the pandemic. I felt it throughout the hour-long finale of The Good Place, one of the best comedies and well-written shows I've ever seen. Most of all, I felt it when I got an email from my school saying that students would not be going back to campus for the rest of the year while I was home for spring break. I still had so many things I wanted to do with the many friends I had made in those 4 years. Most of all, I wished I'd been able to have one final night spent with the people who made me happy, much like how our quartet here got to feel united for perhaps the final time. I wish I could have at least said goodbye to my best friend. It's been 9 months, and I would like to see her again. Yeah.
That's sad. I'm sorry, Shortstop. That sounds rough.
Yeah.
I think this is cool, though, because that Kashum is a thing we feel in the stories we read, certainly, but it also, I think, is a thing we feel in our lives. I think graduation is one of those moments, right, where you just know that things are just not going to be the same. Like, even if you stay in touch with your friends, and I'm very happy that at least my college friends, I've stayed in pretty good touch with all of them, especially you. But I'm rather proud of that. But even if you keep in touch, it's just not the same thing anymore. It's different. It's you were a group, and you're not a group anymore.
Yeah. I mean, even the end of a year of school can feel that way, but graduation for sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, we have Al84001, who says, it's not a book, but boy, if Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't basically an entire story built around Kashum. I spent hours upon hours getting to know that group of outlaws and misfits, sharing in campfire sing-alongs, hunting together, and taking part in each of the joys and sorrows. They're a quartet in every sense of the made-up word, and throughout the course of their tale, you get a front-row seat as it all slowly unravels. From the very first time Arthur coughs a little too much in the middle of a sentence, you're left with the unshakable sense that this will only end in doom. That's great. I've never played Red Dead Redemption 2. I don't play a lot of the open world games, but I've heard very good things about it.
Yeah, man, like video games have gotten so good at making me feel things lately that I actually really want to play this game specifically because I've just, especially in context of the Cyberpunk 2077 conversation, I keep hearing this game brought up as like a good example of a game. So it makes me want to play it anyway.
Hey, Matt, have you ever played a game called God of War?
Yeah. And I mean, that's a game where I felt a huge degree of Kashum toward the end because such a good story. You don't want it to end. But luckily, you can just keep doing all of the challenges after you're done, and you never have to stop.
That doesn't seem healthy.
Ask me if I'm doing that now.
I don't have to.
Yeah.
You've told me 6 times that you are.
All right. Mick CQ says it's going to be hard not to go for many examples in The Dark Tower, but they'll go with La Belle Sauvage, I don't know how to pronounce that, by Philip Pullman. They say the main protagonist, Malcolm, is in over his head and comes to put his trust in a group we would deem the good guys against a corrupt power. It soon becomes clear that this group want to use Malcolm as bait for a pedophile who holds valuable information wanted for the greater good. Given how well Pullman makes you care for Malcolm, I was filled with a sense of dread and had to put the book down. Malcolm is such an innocent and altruistic character who is put into unfair and near impossible situations throughout. Despite this, he faces everything thrown at him head on, knowing he could and will suffer as a result and would volunteer if they asked him to. The fact that they would be so willing to sacrifice his innocence is infuriating, as you think surely this is the idealism they should be fighting against. That's really interesting. I haven't even heard of this book, although we have covered Philip Pullman before.
Yeah, this is it's I think a prequel trilogy. I've read this one. I haven't read the second one. Is out now. This one is when Lyra, the main character from His Dark Materials, is a babby.
Okay.
So I enjoyed it. I just did the audiobook on this one. It was good. I keep wanting to revisit His Dark Materials because like I read it as a kid and I loved it. And then we did the book club on it. And I think we were both kind of cold on the first book, more cold than I expected myself to be. And I keep wanting to revisit it and read the next 2 again and see if it makes me appreciate the series better.
Yeah. I guess I kind of feel you there. I was quite disappointed after hearing such amazing things about it, and maybe I'm just old and crusty and but I don't know. Maybe I should give it another chance.
Yeah. We got plenty of extra time, right? We could just dive into series for a book we didn't particularly like.
Yeah, absolutely. We just added like 6 book series to our lists just in this sitting, and yeah, sure. Why not reread His Dark Materials?
Yeah, sure. Alistair C, aka The Bunslinger, mentions both The Good Place and The Stand, and while they do a very good job of being as vague as possible about the Stand, and I absolutely love the answer they gave, I'm being a tad overprotective for Matt, and so I'm not going to read any of it. But Alistair, you did a good job. I don't want to spoil Matt on anything in The Stand, so we're just not going to do that.
Okay.
They also left this final message that I just had to read out loud. P.S. I mostly deal in Chinese steam buns or baos, but I do occasionally sling hamburger or hot dog buns. And I believe Matt mistaked me for my friend Bumslinger. He deals an ass. Thank you, Bunslinger. And nobody that dropped out of the podcast early before we read the patron supporters a few weeks ago will understand what any of that means, but that's okay because you and I will, and the Bunslinger will.
That's why you got to listen to the end.
Yeah.
Eric T says the size of the book impacts the sense of Kashum for them. They say not just length of story, but physical dimensions of the book. As the pile of pages on the left start to significantly tower over the pages on the right, there's a tactile component to the story ending. Best example for what you mean by the question is probably the first book in the Stormlight Archives. When I read it, it was the only one out, which meant that the book ending was an actual hard stop. It's been a while, so I don't remember names, but one scene where a main guy takes a flying leap across a chasm/bridge/ramp something was so awesome, I stepped back from the book with a big grin and was ready to finally have some things start to go well. Before I actually read any more, though, I saw how close to the end I was and realized that I would get proportionally very little winning in the time remaining versus the amount of hardships that had to be meted out, and also that there was so much unresolved stuff still going on and that it was remarkably unlikely it would all get a satisfying conclusion. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's taking it to the level of like, oh, this is almost over, and I almost know for a certainty that it can't wrap up in a way that I will really feel satisfying or be what I want it to be. Yeah, that's not exactly what I was thinking about when I was thinking about Kashum, but yes, that is a thing that I feel often, I would say.
Sure. We've read that book, The Way of Kings. We read that one.
Yeah, we did the book club on that one too. I love the part you're talking about specifically.
I do too. I have a lot of critiques of Brandon Sanderson books sometimes, but he can sure build to a moment. And that part that Eric is describing here was one of those such moments where you're just like, man, this is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. He takes his time, but he does get there.
Yes. Jeremy K says, this isn't the greatest sense, but is a strong with the force, so to speak, and most recent non-King book I felt Kashum reading finishing. They mean Lev Grossman's The Magician's Land. It's the final book in the Magician's trilogy. The main character loves a book called Fillory and Further. When Quentin finds out that magic is real and goes to a magic college, all while commenting how funny it's real since he's read Harry Potter, he eventually tries to travel to the land of his favorite books, Fillory. And by the time he gets there, things are not all that they seem. The series is a great dive on how our obsessions, or our towers, do you can it, can hurt us and our friends. The journey is following your dreams and growing up at the same time. They got to deal with some shit. It handles love, loss, college threesomes, clock trees, twin ram gods, and some dark stuff. So, man, I love Lev Grossman's Magician's trilogy. I love them. I think they're wonderful books, and it's one of the series that I will freely argue with people that didn't like them, because I think what Grossman does with Quentin in these books is brilliant, and I just loved it so much. Yeah. So I understand that, having that feeling when that wonderful series came to an end.
Yeah, I love them. I love them too, and I think I felt the same. You know, it's interesting because I read the first book, and then I didn't read the sequels for a really, really long time, for several years, which was a mistake, actually, because you're not completing the arc, right? You're misunderstanding. Yeah. I think if you just read the first one, you misunderstand what he's doing with the saga, actually, with the trilogy.
100%. Yeah. And I will also say that the sci-fi series, The Magicians, while incredibly different from books in just about every possible way, is also just really, really good.
Awesome. I haven't watched that, though. Peter T says 2 answers, one which fits the definition and one which is more of a love-loss situation. First answer is A Memory of Light, the final book of the Wheel of Time series. This was a formative series for me. I picked up that series when Book 9, Winter's Heart, had just been published, and reread every book in preparation for the new release up until the final book of the series. My roommate and I, both being huge fans, bought the final book on release day and spent the whole weekend binge reading and talking over our hot takes, and both finished the 1,100 pages in about 2 days.
Jesus.
Yeah. I definitely noticed my reading speed slowing down as I approached the end, knowing that a huge part of my life was coming to a close. The web of the age was breaking, or the kef of the tet, may it do you fine, and I definitely felt the malaise of Kashum as the end neared. The second, not really applicable sense of Kashum I have felt for a book was the first non-Frank Herbert Dune book I read. Immediately, I understood that what I had cherished was forever dead, and a false hope I had harbored for succor in the sun was misplaced. Not quite Kashum, but the next closest thing to my mind.
Well, there you go. This is why I don't need to read any non-Frank Herbert Dune books.
I mean, like I've read what they're about, and I'm just like, this is not Dune. Anyway.
All right. Finally, we have Steve L, who says, I think any and every single Stephen King book has a costume feel. When he spells out exactly what's going to happen, the foreboding feeling is even stronger. The knowing is sometimes the worst part, and the King does it better than anyone. The brilliant thing about him is even when he tells you things are going a certain way, it doesn't always work out the way you thought it would. Constant readers know from experience that there are ways to twist things to surprise you, and Cy King does it just enough to keep you honest. If I had to pick outside of King's Dark Tower and the rest of his works, my favorite would be Aenia in the 3rd and 4th Hyperion cantos. The buildup is long and palpable. Her life story is so profound and it affects so many people's lives. I won't say more because you must read the last 3 books and do a podcast. Please. We're trying, Steve. We actually put book 2 of that on our book club vote last month, and it lost because there was a Brando Sando book on there. Yeah, that's what happens when things go against Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah, that was our bad there.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'd love to keep going on the Hyperion cantos. Actually, I did really like the first one.
So did I.
Yeah. So I just, the only book that I wanted to add that people didn't already talk about, because they mentioned Worm, they mentioned Kingkiller, was Cryptonomicon by Neil Stevenson. And the reason for that one is that there are two parallel plot threads, one of which is happening during World War II, and one of which is happening in, the 90s, I guess. And one of the characters from the World War II plotline is conspicuously not in the modern day plotline. And so that something happened to him, and so it just gives you this sense of dread the entire time, because you really suspect, like, okay, something bad's going to happen to this guy. Like there's no other way, right? So anyway, that was a big, and then as you build toward the end, just, really, really felt the costume there. So cool. That was my answer.
I have never read that one. I'm only two Stevensons in.
That's one of my favorites on the list. So if you're looking to add one to that particular list, that would be the one.
Isn't that a big one? That's a big old fat book.
Yeah, it is a big fat book.
All right. Well, I'll get to it sometime in 2029.
Okay.
All right, folks. That was last week's discussion question. Next week's question, it's not going to be related to this week's reading. I thought we'd do something fun here, because next week's episode is coming out on the 31st of December, the final day of the year. And I thought we'd take a look back at 2020, this miserable, awful year. But not everything was awful and miserable, right? Some good things happened. And what I thought I'd ask you folks is, what is your favorite Stephen King related memory of the year 2020? It can be something King said, something King wrote in another year that you read in 2020, or something else you're listening to, one of the other Stephen King podcasts you're listening to. If you're like me, you listen to a lot of them. So what's your favorite Stephen King related memory of 2020? I think this will be a fun one to kind of kick off the end of the year on. Send those in. We want to hear them. I'm excited.
Yeah, this is going to be fun.
All right, folks, that is it for us here on Kingslingers. Like we said, next week, our last episode of 2020, we will cover the last chapters of Part 2, Devar-Toi. We're covering chapters 11 and 12 of Part 2, and then we'll finish it up and we'll move on to Part 3 in 2021.
Awesome. Remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And of course, as always, the subreddit is a great place to answer the discussion question and just start up any other conversations about Stephen King or whatever else about media that you want to talk about.
Yeah, if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, we strongly recommend you do so and never miss an episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere else in the world that you can listen to podcasts. Yeah. Now or in the future, probably.
Yes. And if you like any of our shows and you want to support them, please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. Special thanks this week to new patrons Doof Troopers, Rob S., MK, and Dave C. Thank you very much. Welcome, and we hope to see you around.
Yeah, and all of you and everyone else at the Doof Trooper level and above will get access to our other Levels of the Tower podcast, where we talk about Stephen King adaptations. Next month, we are going to be taking a look at Secret Window, the Johnny Depp corn-eating movie.
All right.
I'm excited to talk about that one.
Me too.
All right, folks, if you cannot afford to donate, that is absolutely okay. It's the Christmas season. Everyone's buying a lot of gifts for everyone. I understand as well. There are still plenty of ways to help us out. Give the gift of telling someone to listen to us. That's pretty cheap. That's free. That's free.
It's true. It'll bring them so much joy.
Yeah, just wrap a podcast. Of course, you can always help us out by leaving us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. This week's Spotlight review comes from Wavy Gravy, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Feels like a 1,000-year journey in only a few weeks. I like podcasts. I listen to about a dozen in rotation at any given time. When I found out about this podcast 3 weeks ago, I excitedly downloaded the first episode, and I wasn't disappointed. You see, The Dark Tower is my favorite book series of any genre. As a constant reader and someone who's taken the trip to the Dark Tower several times, being able to reread my favorite sections and take deep dives into the details of the books with these guys is so enjoyable. I shelved all my other podcasts and have been marathoning every episode to catch up. Time must work differently when you're listening to this podcast because I'm now only 1 week behind. How deep do you want to go? Do you want to discuss character motivations, connections with other King novels, the quotes beginning the novels, the covers? They cover it all with thoughtful, provocative discussion. I'm looking forward to being caught up enough so that I can answer the discussion questions they have at the end of each episode, which are just as enjoyable as all the analysis. If you like The Dark Tower, you'll love this. Gosh, that's so kind.
Yeah.
I never know what to say at the end of these reviews because I'm just like, it feels very good. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Wavy Gravy, especially for those very, very kind words. And I hope you're caught up. This is from a few months ago, I think. So I think you're probably caught up with us by now.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen that name in discussion question answers before. So
good.
You did get to participate.
Excellent. That makes me happy to hear.
Yeah. All right, folks, that's it. We're done finally with this very long episode. We'll see you right back here next week as the attack on the Al Ghul finally begins. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.